What does it feel like to lie awake in the darkness, listening to the wind claw at your walls, knowing that a single mistake, a dying fire, a broken door latch, a moment of carelessness could mean your family would never see morning? Imagine a world where winter was not an inconvenience but a living threat, where the cold didn't just nip at your skin but searched for every crack in your shelter, every gap in your defenses, as if testing whether you deserved to survive another night. Tonight, we drift back to the edges of the Siberian frontier, to the 18th and 19th centuries, when families huddled in log cabins, separated by days of frozen wilderness, when the sun vanished for weeks at a time, and when the temperature could fall so low that breath turned to ice crystals in the air before reaching the ground. These were people who understood that survival was not guaranteed, that warmth was a fragile thing earned through constant vigilance, and that every sunset brought with it a quiet dread that settled over the household like frost settling on glass. Before we step into the hushed world of these frontier families and their long winter vigils, I'd like to ask one small thing of you. Press that like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these journeys through forgotten corners of the past can continue to find you in the quiet hours. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. What time zone cradles you right now, whether you're wrapped in the deep silence of midnight or just beginning your day as dawn breaks somewhere far from here. Now let the room around you grow a little darker. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan to create that soft, steady hum that blurs the edges of thought, and settle yourself into a comfortable position. We're about to enter a world where every night was a test, where families held their breath and listened to the storm, and where the simple act of keeping a fire alive became an act of quiet heroism. Imagine yourself there, in a small log cabin on the Siberian frontier, somewhere near the Lena River, where the forests stretch endlessly in every direction, and the nearest neighbor might be a half-day's walk through snow that reaches your thighs. You are a parent, a protector, and tonight, like every night when winter tightens its grip, you carry the weight of your family's survival on your shoulders. The cabin is small, perhaps no more than a single room with a sleeping loft where your children burrow under layers of fur and wool. The walls are thick logs hewn from the forest that surrounds you, each one carefully notched and fitted to create a barrier against the world outside. But wood is a living thing, and in the extreme cold of a Siberian winter, the logs shrink and contract, pulling away from each other and creating hairline gaps that invite the cold inside like an unwelcome guest who knows where the door is always unlocked. You can see your breath inside the cabin tonight, even though the fire burns steadily in the hearth. The temperature outside has dropped to perhaps 40 degrees below freezing, maybe more. You stopped trying to measure it years ago because the numbers mean nothing compared to the feeling of the cold, the way it makes your teeth ache and your lungs burn with each inhalation. The wind has been rising since sunset, and now it howls around the corners of the cabin with a sound like wolves singing to one another across the frozen valleys. Your partner is asleep, or trying to sleep, curled beneath a mound of furs and blankets near the warmest part of the room. The children are in the loft above, and you can hear the soft, steady rhythm of their breathing, a sound you listen for constantly, a sound that tells you they are still warm enough, still breathing deeply enough, still alive. You yourself have not truly slept in what feels like days, only drifted through a series of shallow, restless periods where consciousness never fully departs and every sound jerks you back to full alertness. The fire demands constant attention, and you have learned to wake yourself every 2 or 3 hours to add another log, to poke at the embers and coax them back into full flame to ensure that the heat never falters. Letting the fire die would be catastrophic. Within an hour, the temperature inside the cabin would plummet, and within 2 hours, frost would begin creeping up the interior walls. By morning, if you somehow slept through the night, you might wake to find the water barrel frozen solid and your children's breath coming in shallow, dangerous gasps as their bodies fought to stay warm enough to function. So you sit up now, throwing off the single blanket you allowed yourself, and your body protests with 1,000 small aches. Your back is tight from days of chopping firewood and hauling it inside to stack against the wall where it can dry. Your hands are raw and cracked from the constant exposure to cold and heat, from the rough bark of the logs you've been sealing with moss and clay, from the iron tools you grip each day to maintain your fragile foothold in this unforgiving land. You move quietly toward the hearth, your feet wrapped in felt boots that whisper against the wooden floor. The planks beneath you are uneven, warped by years of moisture and temperature changes, and you know every spot where they creak, every place where a gap allows a draft to slip up from the crawl space below. Some nights you have stuffed those gaps with straw or rags, but the cold is persistent and finds new ways inside, new routes through the labyrinth of wood and clay that is your home. The fire has burned down to a bed of glowing coals, still giving off heat, but not enough, never enough. You select a log from the stack nearby, birch because it burns hot and clean, and place it carefully onto the coals, positioning it so that the flames will catch quickly. For a moment the fire dims, smothered by the new wood, and your heart tightens with a familiar anxiety. But then the bark catches, and small flames begin licking up the sides of the log, and you allow yourself to breathe again. Outside, the wind shifts, and a new sound joins the symphony of the storm, a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, that makes you freeze in place. It's just a tree, you tell yourself, just another tree giving way under the weight of ice or splitting in the extreme cold. The forest is full of such sounds in winter, the crack and groan of wood under stress, the crash of branches breaking free and falling to the snow-covered ground. But every sound could be something else, could be the roof beam beginning to fail, could be something large moving through the darkness beyond your walls. You move to the window, though calling it a window feels generous. It's a small opening covered with a stretched and scraped hide that has been oiled to let in a little light during the day while keeping out the worst of the wind. You can see nothing through it at night except the faint glow of snow reflecting whatever moonlight manages to penetrate the clouds. The hide rattles slightly in its frame, and you make a mental note to check the ceiling in the morning to add more clay or moss to the gaps around its edges. The cabin trembles, just a slight shudder, as a particularly strong gust hits the northern wall. You've reinforced that wall twice this winter already, adding extra support beams and packing the exterior base with snow, because snow, paradoxically, is an excellent insulator when packed tightly against a structure. The roof concerns you more than the walls. Up there, layer upon layer of ice and snow has accumulated, and you can hear it settling and shifting, a slow, creaking groan that sounds almost alive. You've climbed up there 3 times this month to shovel off the worst of it, but the ladder is treacherous when covered in ice, and each trip up feels like a gamble with your life. If the roof collapses, your family will be buried under heavy, wet snow and splintered wood in the middle of the night. There would be no time to dig them out, no time to save them. You've heard the stories from other settlements, entire families lost that way, found in spring when the snow melts, still in their sleeping positions, preserved in the cold like insects trapped in amber. You return to the fire and lower yourself onto the wooden stool you keep nearby, a simple seat worn smooth by years of use. Your hands extend toward the flames, and you watch the firelight dance across your calloused palms, the skin tough and scarred from countless small injuries. These hands have built this cabin, have hewn the logs and notched them, have mixed the clay and moss that fills the gaps, have fashioned the door with its heavy wooden bar that you slide into place each night before the sun sets. The door is your first line of defense, thick planks bound together with iron bands that you traded for at great cost, with a latch mechanism that can be secured from the inside. You've reinforced it further with a heavy wooden beam that drops into iron brackets on either side of the frame, creating a barrier that would take considerable force to breach. Not that you expect raiders, this far out on the frontier. Other humans are rare enough that their appearance is usually cause for celebration rather than fear. But there are other things that might test your door on a winter night. Wolves, for instance, driven down from the high country by hunger, sometimes venture close to human settlements when the prey animals grow scarce. You've heard them howling in the distance on many nights, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmonies that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They're cautious around humans generally, but a pack driven mad by starvation might take desperate chances. Your livestock, the 2 goats and handful of chickens you keep in a lean-to attached to the cabin's eastern side, would be an irresistible temptation. Bears are less likely in the deep winter, as most have denned up for their long sleep, but boars remain active, and an angry boar is more dangerous than most predators. You've seen what their tusks can do, have helped neighbors tend wounds that curved and tore rather than cutting clean. Mostly, though, the animals stay away, and the greatest threat remains the cold itself, the relentless, patient enemy that never sleeps and never tires. Your youngest child coughs in the loft above, a small, wet sound that sends a spike of fear through your chest. You listen intently, waiting to hear if the cough repeats, but there's only silence, followed by the rustle of furs as the child shifts position. Illness in winter is a death sentence as often as not. There's no doctor within 100 kilometers, no medicines except the herbs and roots you've managed to preserve from the brief summer months. A fever can burn through a small body in days, and pneumonia has claimed more children in this region than you like to think about. You've taught your children to sleep away from the walls, where frost forms in delicate patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't so deadly. The cold radiates inward from the logs, creating zones of extreme chill that can lower body temperature dangerously even beneath layers of blankets. The center of the room, near the fire, is safest, but there's limited space there, and so the loft becomes necessary despite its drawbacks. Heat rises, which helps, but the loft is also closer to the roof where the cold presses down most strongly. You've stuffed the space between the roof boards and the cabin ceiling with everything you could find: dried grass, moss, scraps of old clothing, even handfuls of goose down saved from butchering. It helps, but nothing keeps the cold out entirely. Nothing ever could, really. The cold is too determined, too patient. It will find every weakness, exploit every gap, and you can only slow it down, never truly stop it. The lantern flickers on the shelf near the door, its oil burning low. You'll need to refill it soon, but oil is precious, and you ration it carefully, using firelight for most tasks and saving the lantern for work that requires precision or for emergencies when you need to move quickly through the darkness. The flame dances behind its glass shield, casting weird shadows that elongate and contract as the wind buffets the cabin. You think about the routine that will begin again in a few hours when the first grey light of dawn seeps into the sky, if the sky is visible through the storm. You'll need to dig out the door, which will likely be blocked by a drift of snow that accumulated overnight. You'll need to check the livestock to ensure they survived the night, to give them what little fodder remains and hope it's enough to keep them alive until spring makes fresh grazing possible again. You'll need to assess any damage to the cabin's exterior, to look for new cracks or weak points that need attention before the next storm arrives. And there will be another storm. There's always another storm. Winter here isn't a single season but a series of battles, each one testing your preparations, your resolve, your luck. Some battles you win decisively, and some you merely survive, and some you lose. A dead goat, a collapsed storage shed, a child's frostbitten fingers that turn black and have to be removed. Your partner stirs under the blankets and you turn to look. You can just make out the shape of a face in the dim light, eyes closed, breath visible as faint puffs of mist. You wonder if they're actually sleeping or just pretending, just lying there with their own fears and cataloguing their own list of things that need to be done, problems that need to be solved. You've been together long enough that you sometimes feel you can read each other's thoughts, can sense the weight of worry even through closed eyes and steady breathing. The marriage happened young, as was common on the frontier. Partnerships formed out of necessity as much as affection, two people joining forces to improve their odds of survival. But over the years, something deeper has grown, a bond forged in shared hardship, in nights like this when you take turns keeping watch, in moments of laughter during the brief summer when the work is still endless, but at least the sun shines warmly and food is abundant. You remember the summer, but it feels like a dream now, like something you might have imagined. It's hard to believe that just a few months ago you could walk outside without wrapping yourself in layers of fur, that water flowed liquid in the streams, that green things grew, and birds sang in the trees. Now the world is monochrome, white snow, black trees, grey sky, and silent except for the wind and the creak of stressed wood. Another log needs to go on the fire, and you rise to add it, this time selecting a piece of pine because the resinous wood will burn longer, giving you perhaps an extra half hour before you need to wake again. The ritual is soothing in its way, this constant tending of the flame, this negotiation with heat and fuel. It's something you can control when so much else is beyond your power. You've calculated your firewood supply a dozen times, running the numbers in your head during the long dark hours. If the winter ends on schedule, if no unusual cold snap extends it by weeks as sometimes happens, if you're careful and strategic about how much you burn, you should have enough. Should. But should is a fragile word, and you've stacked the woodpile higher than you thought necessary, just in case, because running out of fuel when winter still has weeks to go would mean burning furniture, burning the things you need, burning anything that can burn until finally there's nothing left and the cold wins. The floor beneath your feet is cold despite the fire, and you can feel it seeping up through your felt boots, a reminder that the crawl space below is its own problem. Some families dig their cabins partially into the earth, creating a cellar space that stays warmer than the air above. But you built this cabin on level ground, and the space beneath is just a shallow gap filled with frozen dirt, and whatever small animals might have sought shelter there before the cold drove them away or killed them. You've considered blocking off that space entirely, sealing the floor completely, but air needs to circulate and moisture needs somewhere to go or the wood will rot. So you've compromised, stuffing the worst gaps with rags and straw, but leaving some ventilation and accepting that the floor will always be cold, that standing on it barefoot even for a moment would be painful. Your children are old enough now to understand the rules of winter, the behaviors that keep you alive. They know not to open the door without permission, not to venture outside alone, not to waste fuel or food, not to complain about the cold because complaining changes nothing. They're good children, resilient in the way that children raised in hardship often are, and you're proud of them while simultaneously feeling guilty that this is the life you've given them. Sometimes you wonder if you should have stayed closer to the larger settlements, should have remained where there were more people, more resources, more help when things went wrong. But land was expensive there, and work was scarce. And you'd heard stories about the opportunities on the frontier, about the land grants the government was offering to anyone willing to brave the wilderness and establish a presence in these remote territories. So you came, you and your partner, with almost nothing but determination and a few basic tools. You built this cabin with your own hands, felled every tree, shaped every log, and raised it all in the few short months of summer before winter arrived, and work became almost impossible. That first winter nearly killed you. You were unprepared, underprovided, and unlucky with early storms that caught you still trying to finish the roof. You survived by luck as much as anything, and you promised yourself that the next winter would be different, that you'd be ready. And you were more ready, and the winter after that you were more ready still, learning from each mistake, adding each new piece of knowledge to your growing understanding of what it takes to survive in this place. You learned about packing snow against the walls, about the importance of keeping your feet dry, about the signs that precede dangerous storms. You learned which trees make the best firewood and how to stack it so it dries properly. You learned to read the behavior of animals, to know when the wolves were moving closer, to recognize the distant rumble that means an avalanche has let loose somewhere in the mountains. The wind outside reaches a crescendo and then, quite suddenly, drops to near silence. The cabin stops trembling, and for a moment everything feels eerily still, as if the world is holding its breath. You've experienced this before. The eye of the storm, or sometimes just a lull between waves of weather. It won't last long, and when the wind returns, it will likely come from a different direction, testing different walls, finding new weaknesses. You use the quiet moment to check the interior of the cabin more carefully, running your hands along the logs near the door, feeling for new gaps where cold air might be infiltrating. You find one, a small crack that's opened up near the bottom corner, where two logs meet, and you grab a handful of moss from your supply and work it into the space, packing it tight with your thumbs. The moss is frozen and stiff, not as pliable as it would be in warmer weather, but it will expand slightly as it absorbs moisture from the air and create a better seal. There's a clay pot near the hearth filled with embers and covered with a stone lid to retain heat, and you check it carefully. This is your insurance against the fire dying completely, a reservoir of heat that you can use to restart the flame if something goes wrong. You refresh the embers inside, adding a few from the main fire, and replace the lid. The pot itself is warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat that you can feel against your palms. Your stomach growls, reminding you that you haven't eaten since midday, but food supplies are limited, and you've learned to ignore hunger. There's dried meat hanging from the rafters, preserved with salt and smoke during the autumn slaughter, and there's grain stored in sealed containers to keep the mice away. But every meal now reduces what's available for tomorrow, and you never know when tomorrow might bring disaster that prevents hunting or foraging. The children ate before bed, thin porridge and a small piece of dried fish, and your partner had the same. You'll eat in the morning maybe, if the storm has passed, and you have time after completing the dawn chores. Hunger is uncomfortable, but not dangerous, not yet, and you've learned to push the sensation aside and focus on more pressing concerns. You lower yourself back onto the stool and extend your hands toward the fire once more, watching the flames paint the walls with shifting orange light. The shadows they create are almost alive, moving and dancing in ways that can trick the tired mind into seeing shapes that aren't there. You've learned not to trust your eyes on nights like this, when exhaustion and stress can create phantoms in the corners of the room. The loft above creaks as one of the children shifts position, and you listen carefully to ensure they're still sleeping soundly. Their breathing remains steady and deep, and you allow yourself a moment of relief. Sleep is precious for them, a chance for their growing bodies to rest and recover from the day's minor stresses. They don't carry the full weight of responsibility yet. That burden is yours, will be yours for years still until they're old enough to understand and share it. You think about your own parents, about the way they raised you in a small town closer to civilization, about the things they taught you that have proven useful, and the things they never thought to teach because they couldn't imagine you'd end up here, on the far edge of the known world, where survival itself becomes the primary occupation. Your father was a carpenter. And from him you learn to work with wood, to understand its properties and respect its limitations. Your mother was practical and careful, always planning ahead, always preparing for worst cases, and you inherited her tendency toward caution, even though you sometimes chafed against it as a child. Now you're grateful for those lessons, for the voice in your head that says, bring extra firewood and check the roof again and don't take chances. The wind returns as you knew it would, building gradually from a whisper to a roar, and the cabin begins its trembling dance once more. You're so tired that your eyes burn and your thoughts feel sluggish, moving through your mind like thick honey. But sleep is a luxury you can't afford tonight, not with the storm still raging, not with so many things that could go wrong. You add another log to the fire, watching as sparks fly up and disappear into the darkness of the chimney. The chimney is another concern. Ice and creosote buildup can block it, causing smoke to back up into the cabin, and you've had to climb onto the roof more than once to clear it during winter. The smoke needs somewhere to go and the draft needs to pull properly, or the fire becomes dangerous rather than protective. Outside, something heavy hits the ground with a muffled thump, another tree branch giving way probably, or possibly an entire tree finally succumbing to the weight of ice and snow. You imagine the forest around you, imagine hundreds of trees standing like silent sentries in the darkness, all of them burdened beyond their normal limits, all of them under stress that makes them groan and crack. By spring, the landscape will be littered with fallen timber, and you'll spend weeks clearing enough space to move freely and harvesting the wood for next winter's fuel. Always next winter. Always planning ahead because stopping means dying. There's no rest on the frontier, no season when you can relax completely. Even summer is frantic with preparation. Planting, hunting, preserving, building, repairing all the things that winter broke. And then autumn arrives with its harvest and its slaughter and its frantic rush to finish everything before the first snows come, and then winter itself, long and dark and deadly. You wonder sometimes why people choose this life, why anyone would voluntarily subject themselves to such hardship. The answer, you suppose, is different for everyone. For some it's adventure, the appeal of unexplored territories and the romance of frontier living. For others, it's desperation, the lack of options elsewhere, the hope that starting fresh in a new place might offer opportunities that the old world withheld. And for some, like you perhaps, it's stubbornness, the refusal to give up once you've committed, the determination to prove that you can survive anything this land throws at you. The fire crackles and pops, and you watch a small flame leap and twist before subsiding back into the general blaze. There's something hypnotic about fire, something that captures the human attention and holds it in a way that few other things can. You've spent countless hours watching flames, and you'll spend countless more before winter releases its grip. Your partner coughs once, a small sound, and then settles back into sleep. Or perhaps not sleep, perhaps the same state of semi-consciousness that you exist in, where the body rests, but the mind never fully lets go, always monitoring, always listening for the sound that means danger. You've both become light sleepers since coming here, attuned to every noise, every change in the wind, every subtle shift in temperature. The cabin is your castle and your prison, your protection and your cage. For months, you'll barely leave it except to complete necessary tasks, and then only for as short a time as possible. The world shrinks to this single room, these walls, this fire, and the sound of wind that never seems to stop. You rise once more and walk to the door, pressing your ear against the rough wood. Beyond it you can hear the storm's fury, can almost feel the cold pressing against the other side, trying to find a way in. The door holds, the bar holds, and you allow yourself a small moment of satisfaction. This cabin is strong, you've made it strong, and it will protect your family through another night. But there will be another night after this one, and another after that, and dozens or hundreds more before spring. Each one is a test, each one a challenge that must be met with vigilance and care. You cannot let your guard down, cannot become complacent, because the moment you do is the moment something goes wrong. So you return to your stool by the fire, and you settle in for the long watch, knowing that in 2 or 3 hours you'll need to add wood again, knowing that the sky will eventually lighten, but perhaps not for many hours yet, knowing that this is your life now, has been your life, will be your life for as long as you remain in this place on the edge of the world. The shadows dance on the walls, the fire crackles, the wind howls, and you sit and watch and wait, a silent guardian in the darkness, keeping death at bay one log at a time, one night at a time, until finally, eventually, impossibly, winter will end and the world will remember warmth again. There was a man named Yakov Petrovich who lived along the Lena River in the late 18th century. And if you had asked the other settlers in his region what they remembered most about him, they would have told you about his cabin. Not that it was larger than others, or more beautifully constructed, but that it seemed to hold warmth in a way that other cabins did not, that people who visited during the worst storms always remarked on the particular quality of safety they felt within those walls. Yakov was born in 1751, the third son of a family that worked a small plot of land near Yakutsk, and from his earliest memories he understood that winter was not merely a season, but a force that shaped every decision, every action, every hope. His father was a quiet man who spoke little but noticed everything, who could read the coming weather in the behavior of birds and the color of the evening sky, and who taught his sons that survival depended on attention to detail and respect for patterns that others might overlook. The landscape around Yakutsk was one of extremes that tested human endurance in ways that settlers from warmer regions could scarcely imagine. The summer months brought a brief explosion of life when the permafrost surface layer thawed just enough for vegetation to push through, when mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they could suffocate animals, when the sun barely set and work could continue almost around the clock. But winter was the true character of the place, arriving early in September and not releasing its grip until May, bringing temperatures that could drop to 50 degrees below freezing or colder, that could kill an exposed person in minutes if they were caught unprepared. The Lena River itself would freeze solid enough to drive laden sledges across its surface, and the ice would boom and crack throughout the long nights with sounds like artillery fire as it expanded and contracted with temperature shifts. Yakov's father had come to this region as a young man, following rumors of better land and opportunities that turned out to be greatly exaggerated. But by the time he understood the reality of frontier life, he had already married and started a family, and turning back seemed more dangerous than pushing forward. He had learned through bitter experience what it meant to underestimate winter, had lost a brother to exposure during his second year in the region, and had vowed that his own children would be raised with a proper understanding of the forces they lived among. The winter when Yakov was 12 years old, a neighbor's cabin collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. The family inside, a couple with 4 children, were buried in the night, and by the time anyone realized what had happened and dug through the debris, 3 of the children had already frozen to death. The mother survived but lost both feet to frostbite, and the father lived only another year before a fever took him, leaving the remaining family destitute and dependent on the charity of others. The tragedy rippled through the small community in ways both practical and psychological, forcing everyone to confront their own vulnerability and question whether their own structures would hold when tested. Yakov was there when they pulled the bodies from the wreckage, and he saw the way the roof beams had split rather than bent, the way inadequate support had allowed tons of frozen weight to crash down on sleeping people who never had a chance to escape. The youngest child, a girl perhaps 6 years old, had been found with her eyes still closed, having died without ever waking. And that image haunted Yakov more than the others, because it suggested how quickly safety could transform into death, how the comfortable sleep of one moment could become the sleep from which there was no waking. The image stayed with him through all his remaining years, appearing in his dreams during autumn when the first snows began, reminding him that carelessness and poor preparation were not merely inconvenient, but lethal. He would wake sometimes in the night during those transitional seasons, his heart racing, convinced he could hear the sound of splintering wood, and he would lie in the darkness, cataloguing in his mind all the things that could fail, all the weak points that might give way. His father, seeing how the event had affected the boy, began teaching him more deliberately about construction and reinforcement, about how to read the stress in wood and anticipate failure before it happened. They would walk through the forest together, examining trees that had fallen under ice loads, discussing what had made some trunks strong enough to survive, while others gave way. Yakov learned to see structure the way a builder sees it, understanding the invisible forces that push and pull, that compress and tension, that slowly work to bring everything down to the ground. His father would point out the subtle signs, a slight lean in a standing tree that indicated root weakness, a pattern of cracks in bark that suggested internal decay, the way branches distributed weight and how that distribution might change when ice accumulated. These walks became a kind of meditation for Yakov, a way of processing the trauma he had witnessed by channeling it into useful knowledge. He developed an almost instinctive sense for structural integrity, able to look at a building or a tree and immediately identify its vulnerable points, the places where failure would likely begin if stress exceeded capacity. At 16, Yakov apprenticed with a carpenter named Dmitry Alexandrovich, who lived 3 days' walk to the east and who had a reputation for buildings that lasted. Dmitry was an old man by then, perhaps 60, with hands gnarled by decades of work and a permanent squint from years of judging wood grain and measuring angles in poor light. He took Yakov on reluctantly, not because the boy lacked aptitude, but because Dmitry had long ago stopped believing that anyone truly wanted to learn the patient, detail-obsessed approach that real craftsmanship required. Too many young men came to him seeking quick knowledge, wanting to learn just enough to set up their own trade, unwilling to invest the time in truly understanding principles rather than merely copying techniques. But Yakov surprised him with his dedication, arriving each morning before light and working until darkness made further progress impossible. He asked questions that revealed actual thinking rather than mere curiosity, questions about why certain approaches worked rather than just how to execute them. And Dmitry recognized in the boy something of his younger self, that hunger to understand the deep logic of construction that went beyond surface competence. Dmitry taught him how to select timber, how to let it season properly so it would shrink and settle before rather than after being incorporated into a structure. This meant planning years in advance, cutting wood and storing it in conditions that allowed controlled drying, learning to judge by weight and sound and appearance when a piece was ready to use. He taught him about joints and braces, about the way forces travel through a building and where they concentrate, about the importance of allowing for expansion and contraction without creating points of catastrophic failure. Every joint was a potential weakness but also an opportunity for strength if designed correctly, and Dmitry would spend hours with Yakov examining different approaches, explaining why a mortise and tenon might be superior to a simple lap joint in one application but inferior in another. The apprenticeship lasted 3 years, and by the end of it Yakov had helped construct or repair more than a dozen buildings, had learned to work in conditions that ranged from summer heat to autumn cold, and had absorbed a philosophy about building that went beyond mere technique. He understood that construction was ultimately about predicting the future, about imagining all the ways forces would act on a structure over years and decades, about building in resilience against scenarios that might not occur for a generation, but would certainly occur eventually. Dmitri believed that a structure should be honest, that it should reveal, rather than hide its strengths, that the person living inside should be able to look at a beam or a joint and understand intuitively how it worked and what it was doing. This honesty, Dmitri argued, made buildings safer because problems became visible before they became fatal, because a crack in an exposed beam could be spotted and addressed, while a crack hidden behind decorative covering might go unnoticed till failure was imminent. This philosophy extended to aesthetics as well. Dmitri had no patience for ornamentation that served no structural purpose, believing that beauty should emerge from the logic of construction itself, from the clean lines of properly executed joints and the satisfying proportions that naturally arose when form followed function. Yakov absorbed this aesthetic along with the technical knowledge, developing a builder's eye that could appreciate elegance in simplicity, that found satisfaction in solutions that were both effective and economical. When Yakov returned to his family's settlement at 19, he was no longer a boy but a young man with skills that were immediately valuable to a community where every family needed help maintaining their homes against the relentless pressure of winter. He worked for others at first, earning a reputation for thoroughness and reliability, for refusing to compromise even when doing things properly meant more time and effort. People learned that a repair done by Yakov Petrovich would hold, that a reinforcement he added would actually work when tested by storms. He developed a practice of not just fixing the immediate problem, but examining the larger system to understand why the problem had occurred and what other failures might be developing from the same underlying causes. This comprehensive approach sometimes frustrated clients who wanted quick fixes, but more often it earned their trust because they could see that his interest was in their actual safety rather than in collecting payment and moving on to the next job. Word spread that Yakov might charge slightly more or take slightly longer, but that his work represented genuine value, that money spent on his services was money that would not need to be spent again in a year or two. It was during this period that he met Agrafena Ivanovna, a young woman of 18 who had come to the region with her widowed father. She was practical in the way that frontier women needed to be, capable with her hands, unafraid of hard work, and possessed of a calm temperament that never seemed to fracture even when circumstances were difficult. Their courtship was brief, not because of any great passion, though affection grew between them, but because both recognized in the other a partner suited to the life they would have to lead. Yakov saw in Agrafena someone who would understand his careful ways without finding them excessive, who would appreciate the reasoning behind his caution rather than chafing against it, and Agrafena saw in Yakov a man who thought about the future, who would work to protect rather than merely provide. They married in the spring of 1773, and Yakov immediately began constructing the cabin that would be their home. He chose the site carefully, looking for high ground that would drain well, but shelter from the prevailing winds, near enough to the river for water, but far enough to avoid flooding during spring melt. The foundation was his first innovation. Rather than simply placing logs on the ground, as was common practice, he set them on carefully selected stones that would prevent rot and allow air circulation, extending the life of the structure by years or even decades. He spent weeks gathering and positioning these foundation stones, testing their stability, ensuring that the weight distribution would be even and that settling would not create dangerous shifts in the structure above. The walls went up slowly because Yakov insisted on perfect fits between logs, spending hours with his adze and plane to create surfaces that would mate tightly with minimal gaps. Each log was individual, with its own curves and characteristics, and he treated the selection and positioning of each one as a separate problem requiring careful thought. He studied the direction of the wood grain in each log, positioning them so that natural curves and characteristics worked with rather than against the building's needs. A log with a natural bow might be positioned so that bow was compressed under load rather than tensioned, for example, because wood was stronger in compression than in tension, and using the material's natural properties meant the structure would be stronger than one that fought against those properties. When Agrafena asked why he was taking so much time, why they couldn't move into even a partially completed structure and finish work over the following year, he simply took her to the site of the collapsed cabin where 3 children had died, and she asked no more questions about his pace. She understood then that his meticulousness was not perfectionism for its own sake, but a form of love, a way of building protection into the physical world. The roof was his masterpiece, designed with multiple layers of support so that no single beam bore excessive weight, with a pitch steep enough to shed snow, but not so steep that the structure became unstable. He incorporated adjustable braces that could be tightened or loosened as the wood aged and settled, maintaining proper support even as the building changed over years. Other builders thought this unnecessarily complex, arguing that roof design had been essentially solved generations ago and that his additions were overthinking a straightforward problem. But Yakov had learned from Dmitri that complexity in structure was acceptable if it served the purpose of reliability, that the goal was not simplicity for its own sake, but appropriate sophistication matched to the demands of the environment. The adjustable braces were his own innovation, based on principles Dmitri had taught him, but applied in a new way. They consisted of wedges that could be driven deeper or withdrawn slightly, effectively lengthening or shortening the support they provided, allowing the roof's load distribution to be tuned as conditions changed. By the time the first snows came that year, the cabin was complete and provisioned, and Yakov and Agrafena settled into their first winter together. She learned quickly that her husband had particular routines about fire management and door security, about checking seals and monitoring for drafts, and she adapted to these habits because she could see they were born from care rather than obsession. The cabin was indeed warmer than others she had known, holding heat more efficiently because of the careful construction and constant attention to maintenance. The sense of security it provided was worth whatever eccentricities came with being married to Yakov Petrovich, and she found that his vigilance actually made life easier in many ways because problems were caught and addressed before they became emergencies. Their first child, a son they named Nikolai, was born in the summer of 1774, and their daughter Maria followed 2 years later. Yakov was a gentle father, patient with his children, but firm about teaching them the rules that kept people alive. He showed them from their earliest years how to bank a fire properly so that it would burn safely through the night without consuming excessive fuel, how to recognize the sounds that meant a storm was strengthening, how to dress in layers so that sweat wouldn't freeze against their skin when they came back inside from outdoor work. These lessons were woven into daily life rather than delivered as formal instruction, becoming second nature to the children through constant practice and gentle correction. The years passed with the rhythm common to frontier life. Winters endured, summers worked, children growing, the cabin aging but holding strong because Yakov maintained it constantly. He never assumed that because something had worked yesterday, it would work tomorrow, and he inspected every joint and seal at the beginning of each autumn, making repairs before winter arrived to test them. His woodpile was always larger than necessary, his food stores always more extensive than calculation suggested they needed to be, and neighbors sometimes joked about his excessive caution. They would tease him about preparing for winters that would never come, about hoarding resources against disasters that existed only in his imagination, and Yakov would smile and accept the gentle mockery because he knew it came from a place of affection rather than criticism. The winter of 1787 proved him right in ways that stopped the joking permanently. The first storm arrived in late October, weeks earlier than historical patterns suggested was normal, and it was followed by a succession of storms that seemed to have no gaps between them. The temperature dropped to extremes that even the oldest residents couldn't remember experiencing before, and the snow accumulated faster than people could clear it from their roofs. Several families found themselves running low on firewood by mid-November, having not anticipated such an early and severe onset of winter, and community resources were stretched as those with surplus shared with those facing shortage. Yakov's cabin, with its overbuilt structure and carefully maintained seals, weathered the early storms without incident. But 3 days into the worst of them, in the middle of a night when the wind screamed like something alive and in pain, Yakov woke to a sound that sent ice through his veins, a sharp crack from above, the sound of a roof beam beginning to fail under impossible weight. He was up instantly, pulling on his warmest clothing while whispering urgently to Agrafena to get the children dressed and ready to move. The crack had come from the main support that ran the length of the cabin, and if it gave way, the entire roof would collapse inward, and there would be no time for escape once that process began. The wind outside was strong enough that opening the door would be dangerous, potentially tearing it from its hinges and allowing the storm to invade the cabin's interior, and visibility would be nearly zero, but staying inside if the roof was about to fail was not an option. Yakov's mind raced through calculations, how long they could survive outside in these conditions, where they might find shelter, whether they could reach a neighbor's home before exposure overcame them. Agrafena moved with the calm efficiency he had always admired in her, waking the children without frightening them, helping them into their layers of clothing, wrapping their faces against the cold that would hit them the moment they left the cabin's warmth. Nikolai, at 13, understood enough to be scared, but controlled his fear, helping his younger sister with her boots while his mother gathered supplies. Yakov grabbed the emergency pack he kept ready, flint, tinder, dried meat, a knife, rope, and moved to the door, listening to the storm's fury beyond the wood. His hand touched the latch, and he felt the vibration of the wind against the door, a constant pressure that spoke to the storm's terrifying power. But then he paused, his hand on the latch, and made a decision that others might have thought insane. Instead of fleeing, he told Agrafena to take the children into the corner farthest from the suspect beam and to pile every fur and blanket over them to protect against falling debris. Then he pulled the adjustable braces from storage, the ones built into his roof design that no one else had bothered to include in their own structures, and climbed onto the table to reach the support points. Agrafena's eyes widened in understanding and fear, realizing what he intended to do, but she said nothing, simply gathered the children as instructed and began building a protective nest in the corner. The beam was intact but bowing under the load, visibly curved in a way that meant failure was imminent. Ice had built up on the exterior roof, adding weight beyond what even his calculations had anticipated, and the extreme cold had made the wood brittle and less able to bend rather than break. He worked by feel as much as sight, using a mallet to drive the wedges that would tighten the support braces, redistributing the load away from the failing beam onto secondary supports that were still strong. His fingers were clumsy with cold and fear despite being inside, and he fumbled the mallet once, catching it before it fell and waking the children with the noise. Each hammer blow seemed impossibly loud, competing with the howl of the wind, and his hands shook from cold and fear, and the knowledge that if he misjudged anything, they would all die here. He had designed these braces years ago, had tested them and maintained them, but never actually used them in a true emergency, and now he was trusting his family's lives to an innovation that existed more in theory than in practice. Agrafena watched from the corner where she sheltered the children, her face calm, but her eyes betraying her terror ready to throw herself over Nikolai and Maria if the roof came down. The children were silent, understanding without being told that something was wrong, that their father was doing something important, that making noise or asking questions would only make things worse. Maria pressed her face into her mother's side, trying not to cry, while Nikolai watched his father work with an intensity that suggested he was trying to memorize every movement, every technique, filing away knowledge against some future moment when he might need to do the same. The boy's jaw was clenched tight, and Agrafena could feel him trembling against her, whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. It took perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, to get all the braces adjusted. The beam's curve seemed to lessen slightly, or perhaps that was just wishful perception, but at least the cracking sound stopped. Yakov climbed down from the table and stood beneath the center of the roof, looking up, listening, trying to assess whether the structure would hold or whether he'd only delayed the inevitable. The storm raged on outside, adding more weight with each passing hour, and he knew the crisis might not be over, that this could be merely a temporary reprieve before final failure. He told Agrafena they should all stay dressed and ready to evacuate, but that, he thought, the immediate danger had passed. She nodded and brought the children to the fire, letting them warm their hands while still keeping their layers on, and she heated tea to give them something warm to drink, something to steady nerves that had been stretched taut by crisis. Yakov returned to his position beneath the suspect beam, and there he stood for the rest of the night, watching upward, listening for any change in the sounds the roof made, one hand resting on the support column, as if by touching it he could sense the forces moving through the structure. He counted his breaths to stay calm, focused on the physical sensation of air moving in and out of his lungs, using the rhythm to quiet the panic that wanted to overwhelm his thoughts. The storm lasted 2 more days, and Yakov slept only in brief snatches, always waking fully within an hour to check the roof, to listen, to watch for signs of failure. He had Nikolai, then 13 years old, help him shovel snow from the roof 3 separate times during those days, both of them going out into conditions so harsh they could barely see each other, though they were separated by only a few meters. They worked frantically, throwing snow off the sides, trying to reduce the load, while the wind fought to push them off balance, and the cold tried to freeze their hands, even through thick mittens. Nikolai worked without complaint, following his father's instructions precisely, and Yakov felt a surge of pride, mixed with guilt, that he had to expose his son to such danger, had to ask a child to do work that was dangerous even for grown men. The snow they threw off the roof was immediately replaced by more falling and drifting from the wind, but they managed to reduce the total accumulation enough to ease the pressure on the weakened beam. Each trip onto the roof was a calculated risk, gambling that the structure would hold under their added weight, plus the snow they were removing, that a sudden gust wouldn't knock them off the edge, that they wouldn't lose their footing and fall. When the storm finally broke and the sky cleared to a brilliant blue that hurt to look at, Yakov climbed onto the roof one more time to assess the damage. The main beam had held, but just barely. There was a visible stress fracture running perhaps 1/3 of its length, and it would need to be reinforced or replaced before the next winter. The adjustable braces had saved them, had done exactly what he'd designed them to do, and as he sat on the peak of his cabin looking out over the snow-buried landscape, he felt no triumph, but only exhaustion and relief. The world around him was transformed into shapes only barely recognizable, familiar landmarks buried under drifts that had reached heights of 2 meters or more in some places. Other families had not been as fortunate. 2 cabins in the wider settlement area had collapsed, though in both cases the families had managed to escape before being buried, alerted by warning sounds similar to what Yakov had heard. One family lost everything: their home, their food stores, their winter clothing that wasn't on their bodies, and had to be taken in by neighbors who were themselves stretched thin. Several people had frostbite injuries from being caught outside when the storm intensified, and one elderly man died of exposure when he became disoriented while checking on his livestock, wandering in circles until hypothermia claimed him less than 50 meters from safety. The experience changed something in how others viewed Yakov Petrovich and his careful ways. Before, they had thought him perhaps overly cautious, spending too much time on details that seemed unnecessary, preparing for disasters that statistical probability suggested would never occur in a single lifetime. After they came to him for advice, asked him to inspect their buildings and suggest reinforcements, paid him in food and goods to add safety features to structures that had always seemed adequate before. He helped where he could, though he never said, "I told you so," or suggested that the failures of others vindicated his approach, understanding that judgment served no purpose and that what mattered was moving forward with better knowledge. He simply shared what he knew and hoped it would keep more people alive. He drew diagrams showing how forces moved through structures, explained in simple terms why certain designs were more resilient than others, and worked alongside families to implement improvements that might save their lives in future storms. Agrafena, for her part, never spoke about that night to anyone outside the family, but Nikolai and Maria carried the memory of watching their father standing beneath the failing beam for the rest of their lives. They learned from his example that protection sometimes meant making decisions that others might call foolish, that survival often required staying calm when every instinct screamed to panic, that being a guardian meant accepting responsibility for outcomes even when the forces arrayed against you seemed impossibly large. Maria in particular was changed by the experience, developing her own version of her father's vigilance focused on preparation and resource management. She became meticulous about food storage and fire management, about keeping emergency supplies ready, and this careful attention would later make her an ideal partner for frontier life in her own marriage. Yakov continued to maintain his cabin with the same careful attention for the next 30 years, adjusting and improving, learning from each winter what worked and what needed refinement. He replaced the cracked beam during the summer of 1788, installing an even stronger support that incorporated lessons from the near failure, designing it to distribute loads even more effectively than the original. He added a secondary chimney to improve heat distribution, ensuring that warmth could reach all corners of the cabin more efficiently, and that smoke had a backup escape route if the primary chimney became blocked or damaged. He built better insulation into the walls layer by layer over multiple years, using materials that were locally available but carefully processed and positioned to trap air and prevent heat loss. He designed a more efficient woodshed that kept fuel dry and accessible even during the worst storms, positioned close enough to the cabin that retrieving firewood in dangerous conditions required minimal exposure. Each improvement was carefully considered and implemented, tested over seasons to confirm it provided real benefit rather than merely theoretical advantage. His reputation spread beyond the immediate settlement, and people traveling through the region would sometimes stop specifically to see the cabin that had supposedly been built to withstand anything winter could deliver. Yakov would show them around if they asked, explaining his reasoning and techniques, never pretending that he'd discovered some secret, but simply sharing the accumulated knowledge that came from paying attention and refusing to accept unnecessary risk. Some visitors were genuinely interested in learning, taking notes and asking detailed questions, while others seemed more interested in the novelty of meeting someone whose careful ways had become semi-legendary. Yakov treated both groups with the same patient courtesy, understanding that even casual interest might plant seeds of caution that would later grow into life-saving practices. He taught Nikolai the craft of building when the boy was old enough, passing on not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them, the understanding that every choice in construction was also a choice about life and death, that cutting corners, or rushing work, or ignoring potential problems was not merely poor craftsmanship, but a betrayal of the people who would depend on the structure. Nikolai absorbed these lessons and eventually built his own cabin nearby, using his father's principles but adding his own innovations, continuing the evolution of knowledge that might someday make frontier life less precarious. Maria married a man from a settlement 2 days to the north, and when she left, she took with her a set of detailed drawings Yakov had made of his cabin's design, along with written notes about maintenance routines and what to watch for as warning signs of potential failure. Her husband was initially skeptical of the need for such detail, viewing it as excessive worry from an overly protective father, but Maria insisted, and their home became known in their region as particularly well constructed and secure. Other families began incorporating elements of Yakov's design into their own buildings, and gradually the collective knowledge of the region improved. Death rates from structural failures declined, and the frontier became marginally less dangerous. This diffusion of knowledge happened slowly and imperfectly, filtered through varying levels of understanding and commitment, but it represented genuine progress. Agrafena remained Yakov's steady partner through all those years, never complaining about his particular habits, understanding that his vigilance was an expression of care rather than anxiety. She developed her own expertise in managing the interior environment, knowing exactly how to position bedding for maximum warmth, how to ration food so it lasted without anyone feeling desperately deprived, how to keep the children calm and occupied during the worst storms when being trapped inside for days could fray anyone's nerves. Together they created not just a physical structure but a system of living that acknowledged the reality of their environment while refusing to be defeated by it. Other couples might have constant tensions about the division of labor or the allocation of resources, but Yakov and Agrafena had long ago learned to function as a single unit with complementary skills and shared priorities. Their cabin was warm not just because of Yakov's building skills, but because of the partnership that maintained it, the cooperation that made vigilance sustainable over decades rather than just winters. They developed their own language of small gestures and looks, communicating complex information without words, coordinating their efforts with the precision of people who had spent decades learning each other's rhythms and patterns. When Yakov was 60 years old, during the autumn of 1811, he was helping a neighbor repair a damaged roof when he fell and broke several ribs. The injury itself wasn't immediately life-threatening, but at his age and in that environment, any significant injury carried compounded risks. Immobility led to muscle loss and weakness, pain made sleep difficult which impaired healing, and winter's demands couldn't be postponed to accommodate recovery. He spent that winter largely immobile, directing Nikolai in the maintenance tasks he could no longer perform himself, frustrated by his helplessness, but grateful that he taught his son well enough that the work could continue without him. The transition from being the primary protector to being dependent on others was difficult for Yakov, who had spent his entire adult life being the one others relied upon. The ribs healed poorly, leaving him with permanent pain that worsened in cold weather, and from that point forward his physical capability declined steadily. He could no longer climb to the roof or lift heavy logs, could no longer do the strenuous work that frontier life constantly demanded, and this loss of capability felt to him like a betrayal by his own body. But his mind remained sharp, and he spent his remaining years as an advisor and teacher, helping others plan their buildings and solve structural problems, sharing accumulated knowledge with anyone who would listen. He found new purpose in this role, discovering that teaching could be its own form of building. That knowledge passed on was a kind of structure that could shelter people even after he was gone. Agrafena cared for him through the decline with the same steady competence she'd brought to every other challenge, adjusting their routines to accommodate his limitations, taking on tasks that had once been his responsibility. She was 60 herself by then, and the work was hard, but she never suggested they should leave the frontier or become dependent on their children. This was their home, the cabin they had built together, and she would maintain it as long as she was able. She found satisfaction in continuing the work they had begun as a young couple, in keeping faith with the life they had chosen and the values they had lived by. Yakov died in the winter of 1819 during a storm that was fierce but not extraordinary by the standards of the region. He simply went to sleep one night by the fire and didn't wake in the morning, his heart having finally decided it had beaten enough times and carried enough weight. Agrafena found him in his chair, still in the position he'd settled into while watching the flames, and she sat with him for a long time before calling Nikolai to help with the burial preparations. The cabin was warm and secure around them, fulfilling even in that moment the purpose for which it had been built. They buried him in the spring when the ground thawed enough to dig, in a spot on a small rise where the forest opened up enough to let in light. Many people came to the funeral, families from throughout the region who had known him or whose homes incorporated some element of his knowledge. No one gave speeches or made grand pronouncements about his importance, because that wasn't the frontier way, but everyone there understood that they were burying someone whose careful attention to detail had saved lives, whose refusal to accept unnecessary risk had made survival possible for others besides his own family. The silence at his grave was more eloquent than words, a collective acknowledgement of debt that could never be fully repaid. Agrafena lived another 7 years, remaining in the cabin that Yakov had built, maintaining it according to the routines they'd established together. Nikolai visited often, bringing his own children to learn from their grandmother, to hear stories about their grandfather and understand what his approach to building and life had meant. When Agrafena finally died in 1826, the cabin passed to Nikolai, who continued living in it and maintaining it according to his father's principles. He added his own improvements over time, but always in ways that honored the original design's logic, treating the structure with the reverence one might show a holy text or a family heirloom. The structure stood for more than a century, eventually becoming recognized as one of the oldest continuously inhabited buildings in the region. Researchers who studied it marveled at the quality of the construction, at the innovative features that anticipated problems others wouldn't recognize for decades, at the evidence of constant maintenance and gradual improvement over generations. The cabin became, in a way, a monument to the idea that survival on the frontier was not about heroic gestures or dramatic moments, but about patient, consistent attention to the small details that collectively made the difference between living and dying. It stood as proof that careful thought applied over time could create something larger than the sum of its parts, that protection built into physical structure could outlast the builder and shelter generations not yet born. And in the quiet hours of winter nights, when storms howled around that sturdy structure and families inside sat warm by their fires, some of them would think about Yakov Petrovich standing beneath a failing beam, making adjustments by feel in the darkness, refusing to panic, refusing to abandon his home and his family to chance. They would think about the choices he made, the knowledge he accumulated, the care he invested in every joint and seal and support, and they would understand that this was what protection looked like, not bold and dramatic, but patient and thorough and endlessly vigilant. His legacy wasn't fame or wealth or even particular recognition beyond his local community. His legacy was living children and grandchildren, was cabins that stood when storms came, was knowledge passed forward about how to build things that would shelter people through the night, was the accumulated wisdom that made each generation slightly more resilient than the one before. And perhaps that was enough, perhaps that was everything, because what more could anyone ask for than to have created safety in a dangerous world, to have given people a little more chance of seeing morning to have built something that would outlast your own hands and continue protecting people you would never meet. The cabin on the Lena River stood as testament to this simple truth, that love could be built into wood and stone, that care could be measured in the precision of joints and the thickness of walls, that the truest form of legacy was not monuments or memory, but the quiet continuation of life made possible by attention to detail that never wavered. Even when the wind screamed and the roof creaked and standing beneath a failing beam seemed like madness to anyone who didn't understand that sometimes protection means staying when every instinct says to run, means holding the structure together with your own body if necessary, means being the last thing between the storm and the people who depend on what you've built, even if they never know your name. There are objects in museum collections throughout Russia that curators handle with a particular kind of uncertainty. Small artifacts recovered from the sites of old frontier settlements that resist easy explanation. Iron charms no larger than a child's hand, marked with symbols that don't quite match any known religious iconography. Clay tablets with scratched patterns that might be writing or might be something else entirely. Bundles of specific herbs wrapped in birch bark and hidden in the walls of collapsed cabins, placed there deliberately by people whose reasoning has been lost to time. These objects speak to a layer of frontier life that exists somewhere between practical preparation and something harder to categorize, a set of beliefs and practices that people engaged in quietly, without much discussion, without writing down their purposes or meanings. The historical record gives us facts about construction techniques and food preservation, about trade routes and political administration, but it preserves less well the private rituals that families enacted in the dark hours, the protective customs that weren't quite superstition and weren't quite practical planning, but existed in some ambiguous space between. The silence surrounding these practices wasn't necessarily secretive in nature, but rather reflected the way certain knowledge was transmitted, through demonstration rather than explanation, through inherited action rather than articulated belief, through the quiet understanding that some things were simply done because they needed to be done without requiring justification or theological elaboration. Archaeologists working in the Lena River region during the 1960s excavated a series of cabin sites dating from the late 18th century, and what they found puzzled them in ways that subsequent research has only partially resolved. Nearly every cabin examined contained evidence of small iron objects that had been deliberately placed near entrances, not door hardware or structural elements, but carefully positioned decorative pieces that served no obvious functional purpose. The iron itself was too valuable in frontier settlements to waste on pure ornamentation, and yet these objects appeared in cabin after cabin, suggesting some widely shared understanding about their importance. The consistency of placement was particularly striking. Almost always within arm's reach of the door, positioned where they would be among the last things seen when leaving, and the first things noticed upon returning, as though their effectiveness depended on this specific positioning within the domestic space. The charms varied in their specific designs, but common elements appeared frequently enough to suggest shared meaning. Many featured circular patterns with radiating lines, reminiscent of the sun but created with a level of care that seems excessive if they were merely decorative. Others showed stylized representations of trees or animals, particularly bears and birds, rendered in simple lines that nevertheless conveyed a sense of deliberate symbolism. A few incorporated what appeared to be lettering, but in alphabets that didn't match standard Russian script and that no researcher has successfully decoded. The quality of craftsmanship ranged from crude scratches on scrap metal to elaborately worked pieces that suggested the involvement of someone with genuine metalworking skill, yet all shared that quality of intentional placement and evident importance that transcended their material value. One particularly intriguing find was a charm recovered from a cabin site near Gigansk, dated to approximately 1780 based on other artifacts found at the location. The charm was larger than most, perhaps 8 centimeters across, and had been mounted above the door lintel in a position that would have made it visible to anyone entering or leaving. The design showed a circle divided into 4 quadrants, each containing different symbols, what appeared to be flames, falling snow, a crescent moon, and something that might have been a stylized eye or a star. The back of the charm bore a single word scratched in rough letters, relied, which means protect or guard. The iron showed signs of having been handled repeatedly, with wear patterns suggesting that people had touched it regularly, perhaps as part of some daily ritual or simply out of habit, the way one might touch a door frame while passing through it. The researcher who first examined this object, a woman named Dr. Svetlana Borisovna Kuznetsova, spent years trying to understand its context and meaning. She interviewed elderly residents of the region whose families had lived in the area for generations, asking about protective customs and winter traditions that might have been passed down through oral history. What she discovered was a fragmentary but fascinating picture of practices that had largely died out by the early 20th century, but that had once been widespread among frontier settlements. Her notebooks, now archived at the Institute of Archaeology in Yakutsk, contain hundreds of pages of testimonies, most of them frustratingly incomplete or contradictory, but collectively painting a picture of a rich tradition of protective practices that had operated just below the surface of documented history. Several of her informants remembered their grandparents or great-grandparents mentioning the iron charms, though the specific beliefs associated with them had become vague with time. Some recalled being told that the iron kept the cold spirits outside, though what exactly was meant by cold spirits remained ambiguous. Others said the charms were meant to mark the boundary between family warmth and the wild cold, creating a kind of threshold that the winter couldn't cross. One elderly man claimed his grandmother had told him that the iron needed to be fed periodically with drops of lamp oil or rendered fat, though he couldn't explain why or what this was supposed to accomplish. The language used in these accounts was consistent in its imprecision, as though the informants were reaching for concepts that their grandparents had understood viscerally but had never quite articulated in words that could be passed down cleanly across generations. Dr. Kuznetsova also documented a related practice that appeared in multiple accounts, the custom of leaving a small piece of bread near the door on certain nights during winter. The bread was never to be eaten even if the family was desperately hungry, and in the morning it would be taken outside and left in the snow some distance from the cabin. The purpose of this ritual was described variously as feeding the wandering cold, or giving the winter its share, or keeping hunger outside where it belongs. The practice seemed to function as a kind of offering or appeasement, acknowledging the winter's power while attempting to negotiate with it through symbolic gestures. Several informants specified that the bread had to be torn from a fresh loaf, never given as a stale remnant, suggesting that the offering needed to represent genuine sacrifice rather than disposal of unwanted food. What makes these customs particularly interesting is their apparent fusion of practical concern with metaphorical or spiritual thinking. The people who practiced them were not naive or ignorant. They understood perfectly well the physical mechanics of cold and wind and storm. They knew that iron charms didn't actually prevent freezing, that bread left in the snow didn't literally feed anything, and yet they performed these rituals anyway, suggesting that the practices served some psychological or cultural function that justified the small expenditure of resources they required. The sophistication of frontier survival strategies, the careful calculation of food stores, the precise understanding of weather patterns, the engineering knowledge required to build structures that could withstand extreme conditions existed alongside these symbolic practices without apparent contradiction, suggesting a worldview that had room for both empirical observation and ritualized protection. Perhaps the charms and offerings provided reassurance, a sense of having done everything possible to protect the household, including addressing forces that might exist beyond the purely physical. Perhaps they functioned as mnemonics, reminding people to check their doors and maintain their vigilance each time they saw the charm or prepared the bread offering. Perhaps they were simply traditions that connected frontier families to older beliefs and practices from the regions they'd emigrated from, maintaining cultural continuity in an environment that was strange and often hostile. The psychological benefit of ritual shouldn't be underestimated. In conditions where genuine control over one's environment was limited and where survival often depended on factors beyond human influence, the act of performing protective rituals might have provided a crucial sense of agency, a feeling that one wasn't simply passive before the forces of winter, but was actively engaged in defending one's household through all available means. Another mystery that researchers have struggled to explain involves the strange construction features found in some frontier cabins, hidden spaces and unusual architectural choices that don't align with any documented building practices. Several excavated sites revealed evidence of crawl spaces beneath the main floor that were much more elaborate than would be needed for simple air circulation or moisture control. These spaces had been carefully constructed with clay-lined walls and what appeared to be ventilation systems, and in some cases contained the remains of clay pots or metal containers that might have held embers or hot stones. The labor investment in these features was substantial, representing weeks or even months of additional work beyond what would have been required for a standard frontier cabin, and this fact alone suggests that whatever purpose they served was considered crucial by the builders. The most elaborate example was found near Villejuisk in 1973, a cabin site that dated to approximately 1790. Beneath the main floor, accessible through a carefully disguised trapdoor, was a space perhaps 2 meters long and 1 meter high, lined entirely with river stones that had been mortared together with clay. The space contained the remains of 3 large clay vessels that had clearly been designed to hold something hot, along with what appeared to be a chimney system that vented separately from the cabin's main chimney. The entire setup suggested a sophisticated heating system, but its purpose and operation remained unclear. The stones used in the construction weren't local. Geological analysis showed they had been brought from a riverbed nearly 5 kilometers away, meaning someone had transported hundreds of kilograms of stone across difficult terrain specifically for this hidden chamber. One theory proposed by structural engineers who examined the site was that this represented a form of radiant floor heating, with the hot vessels warming the stones, which would then radiate heat upward through the floorboards. This would be a remarkably advanced system for an 18th century frontier cabin, but not impossible. Similar principles had been used in other cultures, and frontier builders were often innovative in their attempts to maximize heat efficiency. The separate venting system would have prevented smoke from entering the main cabin, while allowing the vessels to be replenished with hot embers or coals. If this theory is correct, it would represent a remarkable achievement in vernacular architecture, a solution to the heating problem that was far more sophisticated than the simple hearth fires typically assumed to be the only warming method available in such structures. But other researchers noted that the effort required to construct such a system was enormous, and that maintaining it through a winter would have required resources and attention that most frontier families could barely spare. Why invest in something so elaborate when a well-maintained hearth fire would provide adequate heat? And why hide the access behind a concealed trapdoor if the purpose was purely practical? These questions led to alternative theories that the space was intended as an emergency shelter where family members could retreat if the main cabin became compromised, that it served some ritual or spiritual purpose that wasn't reflected in the physical evidence, or that it represented an experiment in heating technology that was ultimately abandoned as impractical. The concealment aspect is particularly puzzling, as practical features of frontier architecture were typically visible and accessible, not hidden behind false floorboards and disguised entrances. Adding to the mystery, oral histories collected in the region included occasional references to what people called the warm rooms beneath, spaces that were supposed to exist under some cabins, but that were never to be spoken of openly or shown to outsiders. The descriptions were vague and contradictory. Some informants suggested these were secret refugees prepared in case of attack by raiders or hostile animals. Others hinted at connections to folk beliefs about earth spirits or underworld realms, and still others simply acknowledged that their grandparents had mentioned such things but never explained them clearly. The prohibition against discussing these spaces with outsiders was mentioned by multiple informants, suggesting it was a genuine element of the tradition rather than simply individual reticence, though the reason for the secrecy was never adequately explained. One elderly woman interviewed by Dr. Kuznetsova in 1987 provided an account that captured the ambiguity surrounding these hidden spaces. Her great-grandmother, she reported, had lived in a cabin that supposedly had a room where the winter couldn't reach, and this was where the family would retreat during the absolute worst storms, when the main cabin seemed on the verge of failing. The woman couldn't describe the room's actual construction or location, as her great-grandmother had died before passing on those details, but she remembered being told that the space was always warm, warm like summer earth, and that entering it felt like going down into sleep while still being awake. The description included details about the room being accessed through the floor, and about it being just large enough for the family to lie down together, but nothing about how the warmth was maintained or what the space actually looked like. This description is tantalizing but frustratingly imprecise, mixing possible physical details, a heated underground space, with metaphorical or dreamlike language that might reflect actual experience or might be embellishment added through generations of retelling. It's possible the woman was describing genuine memories transmitted from her ancestor, or possible she was recounting folklore that had become attached to her family history, or possible some combination of both where real events had been gradually transformed into something more mysterious through the natural drift of oral tradition. The comparison to sleep is particularly intriguing, as it might describe the drowsiness that comes with entering a very warm space from extreme cold, or it might be purely metaphorical, or it might hint at other factors like reduced oxygen levels in a poorly ventilated underground chamber. The question of wind patterns and their interpretation represents another area where frontier practices blurred the line between observation and belief. Multiple historical accounts mention that settlers paid careful attention to the specific qualities of wind during winter storms and that certain patterns were considered ominous or dangerous beyond what simple strength alone would suggest. References appear to the seeking wind or the searching cold or the wind that knows your name, phrases that seem to attribute intention or consciousness to meteorological phenomena. These descriptions appear in documents written by educated administrators and merchants as well as in oral accounts from settlers, suggesting they weren't merely folk beliefs confined to the uneducated, but represented a shared interpretive framework that crossed social boundaries. Some researchers have dismissed these descriptions as simple folklore, the kind of anthropomorphization of natural forces that occurs in many cultures. But others have noted that the settlers who used this language were the same people who demonstrated sophisticated practical knowledge about weather prediction and storm behavior. They could read approaching weather systems in cloud formations and animal behavior, could judge wind speeds and directions with impressive accuracy, and could plan their activities around meteorological patterns with success rates that suggest genuine expertise. Why, then, would they also engage in what appears to be magical thinking about wind having consciousness or purpose? The coexistence of empirical weather knowledge with this seemingly supernatural framework suggests something more complex than simple ignorance or primitive belief. One possibility is that the language of intentionality served as a shorthand for complex observations that were difficult to articulate precisely. When settlers spoke of the wind that searches, they might have been describing a particular pattern of gusting that probed for structural weaknesses, finding gaps and cracks that steady wind of the same speed might not exploit. The personification made the phenomenon easier to discuss and remember, turning abstract air pressure dynamics into a concrete image that could be shared and understood without requiring technical vocabulary. Modern meteorology has terminology for complex wind behaviors, microbursts, wind shear, gustnadoes, but frontier settlers lacked this specialized language and so created their own metaphorical framework for communicating similar observations. Another possibility is that the language reflected a genuine belief system that existed alongside practical knowledge, a worldview in which natural forces were understood both physically and as possessing some kind of agency or spirit. Many cultures maintain these dual frameworks without seeing contradiction, understanding, for instance, that illness is caused by bacteria, while also believing that spiritual forces might influence health outcomes. Frontier settlers might have similarly understood that cold was the absence of molecular motion, while also believing that winter itself had qualities that transcended simple physics. This kind of cognitive dualism is more common than post-Enlightenment Western thinking often acknowledges, and it allows for both practical effectiveness and spiritual or emotional meaning to coexist within the same explanatory framework. Archaeological evidence of what researchers call threshold objects, items deliberately placed at the boundaries between interior and exterior spaces, suggests that the concept of boundary protection was taken seriously in ways that went beyond simply building a strong door. Excavations have found everything from horseshoes nailed above entrances to bundles of specific plant materials woven into door frames, from carefully arranged stones at doorsteps to what appear to be deliberately broken pottery sherds buried at threshold points. The distribution of these objects follows patterns that suggest deliberate placement according to some system of belief or practice, with certain objects appearing more frequently on east-facing doors, others on north-facing entrances, and some seeming to be positioned according to the specific geography or exposure of the cabin site. The plant materials are particularly interesting because they show deliberate selection that suggests specific beliefs about which species offered protection. Birch appears frequently, which makes practical sense as it was abundant and useful, but so do several other species that had no obvious practical application. Dried artemisia, or wormwood, appears in multiple sites, as does juniper, and a particular variety of willow that grows only in very specific soil conditions. The effort required to gather and preserve these materials suggests they were valued, and the consistent patterns across different settlements suggests shared knowledge or tradition rather than individual eccentricity. Some of these plants would have needed to be collected at specific times of year and prepared in particular ways to preserve them, representing a significant investment of time and knowledge. One researcher, Dr. Mikhail Andreevich Volkov, conducted a study in the 1990s examining the chemical properties of the plant materials found in frontier cabin sites, wondering if they might have had practical benefits that would explain their use, perhaps insect-repelling properties or aromatic qualities that made interior spaces more pleasant, or even medicinal applications that could be activated by hanging the plants in specific locations. His analysis found that several of the species did indeed have compounds that might repel certain insects or inhibit mold growth, providing a rational explanation for at least some of the plant choices. The artemisia, for instance, contains compounds that are known to repel moths and other insects, while juniper has mild antimicrobial properties that might have helped preserve door frames from rot. But other species showed no such properties or were used in ways that wouldn't have activated whatever useful characteristics they possessed. Dried artemisia placed above a door would have minimal insect repelling effect, and juniper buried at a threshold rather than burned would release none of its aromatic compounds. Dr. Volkov concluded that while some plant uses might have had unintentional practical benefits, the primary motivation was likely cultural or spiritual rather than material, part of a system of protective practices that operated according to its own internal logic rather than purely physical cause and effect. His study also revealed that certain plant combinations appeared repeatedly, suggesting that there was a shared body of knowledge about which species worked together or complemented each other in their protective functions, though what those functions were believed to be remains unclear. The concept of the black cold appears in several historical documents and oral accounts from the frontier region, described as a phenomenon distinct from ordinary winter weather. The descriptions are remarkably consistent across sources, a cold that seemed to move through the landscape with purpose, that could be heard walking on the snow or breathing against the walls, that brought with it a particular quality of darkness or heaviness that went beyond simple absence of light. People who claimed to have experienced the black cold reported feeling watched, feeling that the cold itself was aware of them and searching for them specifically. The consistency of these descriptions across different time periods and geographic locations is striking, suggesting either a genuine shared experience of some unusual meteorological condition or a cultural narrative that was so widespread it shaped how people interpreted their experiences of extreme cold. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for these accounts, ranging from the psychological effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation to possible correlations with unusual meteorological events like temperature inversions or electrical phenomena. Some have suggested that the black cold might have been how people described periods of extreme low temperature combined with high winds, conditions that would indeed be more dangerous than cold alone, and that might produce unusual acoustic effects as wind moved through frozen forests and over ice formations. Temperature inversions, where warmer air traps colder air near the ground, can create unusual atmospheric conditions including strange sound propagation, visual distortions, and a particular quality of oppressive heaviness that might match some of the descriptions. Others have focused on the psychological dimension, noting that humans have a tendency to perceive intentionality in random events, particularly when under stress or in threatening environments. The long darkness of Siberian winter, combined with the very real danger that cold represented, might have predisposed people to interpret weather patterns as possessing agency or purpose. The shared cultural narrative about the black cold could have reinforced these interpretations, creating a feedback loop where individual experiences were shaped by collective expectation. Isolation and darkness are known to produce various psychological effects, including heightened pattern recognition, increased anxiety, and sometimes even hallucinations or altered states of consciousness, any of which might contribute to experiences that felt genuinely different from ordinary cold. But some accounts include specific details that resist easy explanation through either meteorological or psychological frameworks. Multiple sources describe the black cold as being preceded by a particular smell, variously described as like iron, or like the inside of ice, or like stone before it breaks. They describe sounds associated with its passage, not just wind, but a kind of creaking or groaning that seemed to come from the snow itself, or a high-pitched noise just at the edge of hearing that would persist for hours. And they describe visible effects, including frost patterns that formed in unusual configurations or ice crystals that seemed to hang in the air despite the absence of fog or precipitation. These sensory details appear across multiple independent accounts, suggesting they weren't simply literary embellishments, but represented attempts to communicate genuine sensory experiences, however those experiences might ultimately be explained. A particularly detailed account appears in the diary of a frontier administrator named Semyon Pavlovich Markov, who was stationed near Olenyok from 1802 to 1809. Markov was an educated man with training in surveying and natural science, someone predisposed to rational explanation and skeptical of folk beliefs. Yet his diary contains an entry from February 1806 describing an experience that clearly disturbed him enough to record it, despite his usual preference for bureaucratic conciseness. The entry stands out not only for its length, nearly 3 pages in a diary where most entries were a few lines, but for its tone, which shifts from clinical observation to something approaching genuine fear as the description progresses. He wrote of a night when the temperature dropped suddenly and dramatically, and with it came what he described as a quality of pressure, as though the air itself had become heavy and was pushing down on the settlement. He noted that the dogs began behaving strangely, whining and refusing to go outside, even when usually eager, and that the normal sounds of settlement life seemed muffled or distant, despite no change in actual conditions. Most striking was his observation that frost began forming inside his cabin, despite the fire burning normally, creeping across the walls in patterns that he described as deliberate, as though being drawn by an unseen hand. He documented that the frost patterns weren't the random branching typically seen, but formed what appeared to be geometric shapes, circles and lines that reminded him of the symbols he'd seen on the iron charms that settlers placed above their doors. Markov's scientific training led him to check his thermometer repeatedly to verify that the fire was producing adequate heat to rule out any obvious physical cause for the internal frost formation. He found none and eventually concluded that he was experiencing an atmospheric phenomenon he didn't have the knowledge to explain, some combination of pressure and temperature and humidity that created unusual conditions. But his description of the event carries an undertone of genuine unease that seems at odds with the rational explanation he tried to construct, and he ended the entry by noting that the cold tonight has a character that makes one understand why the settlers speak of it as though it were alive. In a subsequent entry, written several days later, he mentioned that 2 families in the settlement had lost members during that night, an elderly woman and a child, both of whom had been in apparently good health before the temperature drop, suggesting that whatever had occurred had posed real danger beyond the merely psychological or perceptual. The archaeological record provides one more category of puzzling evidence in the form of what researchers call threshold pits. Small holes dug just outside cabin doors, usually no more than 20 centimeters deep and 10 centimeters in diameter, that appear to have been maintained and kept clear of snow throughout winter. The pits sometimes contain evidence of burning, suggesting that small fires or hot coals were placed in them periodically, but the amount of carbon residue is usually minimal, indicating that whatever burned there did so briefly or in small quantities. The careful excavation and analysis of these features has revealed that they were often lined with stones or clay, preventing collapse and suggesting they were intended for repeated use rather than being one-time events. The distribution of threshold pits is uneven. They appear at some cabin sites but not others, with no obvious pattern based on geography or date or the wealth and status of the inhabitants. Some cabins have a single pit directly in front of the door, while others have multiple pits arranged in what might be deliberate geometric patterns. The largest concentration found so far is at a site near Yakutsk, where 7 pits were arranged in a semicircle facing the door, each one carefully maintained with stone lining to prevent collapse. The geometric precision of this arrangement suggests intentional design rather than random placement, and the effort required to dig, line, and maintain 7 separate pits would have been considerable, again suggesting that whatever function they served was deemed important enough to justify significant labor investment. No historical documents explicitly describe the purpose or use of these pits, and oral histories collected in the 20th century included only vague references to keeping fire at the threshold or burning the boundary. One informant told researchers that her grandmother had mentioned a practice of placing hot coals in a hole before the door on specific nights, particularly when storms were expected, but couldn't explain what this was supposed to accomplish. The coal would burn briefly and then be allowed to extinguish, and in the morning the ashes would be scattered in the snow around the cabin. The timing of these rituals seemed to follow some calendar that the informant couldn't reconstruct, though she thought it might have been connected to the phases of the moon or to the darkest period of winter, that span of weeks when the sun barely rose above the horizon and the cold was at its most intense. Various theories have been proposed to explain the threshold pits, that they were used for some form of smelting or metalworking, that they were cooking areas used when the interior hearth was too hot during summer, that they served a religious or ritual purpose connected to fire worship or threshold protection, that they were simply convenient locations for disposing of ashes and coals from the main fire. None of these explanations fully accounts for the care with which the pits were constructed and maintained, or for the specific placement patterns that appear at some sites. The smelting theory is particularly weak, as the pits are far too small for any significant metalworking, and there's no evidence of the slag or other metalworking debris that would be expected if this were their purpose. The most intriguing aspect of the threshold pits is that they seem to have been kept clear of snow even during storms, suggesting regular attention and maintenance. This implies that whatever purpose they served was considered important enough to justify going outside during difficult weather specifically to clear them. One researcher calculated that maintaining even a single threshold pit through a full winter would require dozens of trips outside, each one representing exposure to dangerous cold. People wouldn't have done this without a compelling reason, whether practical, cultural, or spiritual. The evidence of repeated clearing, visible in the stratigraphic analysis of the pits, shows that this wasn't occasional maintenance, but regular, systematic attention, suggesting that the pits needed to be kept accessible and ready for immediate use at all times. The question of why fire specifically would be placed at the threshold has generated considerable discussion among researchers. Fire has protective and purifying symbolism in many cultures, and the threshold itself is often understood as a liminal space requiring special attention in folk belief systems. The combination of these two elements, fire and threshold, might represent a particularly powerful form of protection, a way of fortifying the boundary between interior domestic space and the dangerous exterior world. Some researchers have drawn parallels to practices in other cultures where fire is used to mark or purify boundaries, though the specific form of the threshold pits doesn't match any documented tradition closely enough to establish clear cultural descent. As we drift through these mysteries, through the fragments of practices and beliefs that survive only as archaeological traces and fading memories, we're left with more questions than answers. We can see that frontier families engaged in elaborate protective customs that went far beyond simple practical preparation, that they invested time and resources in rituals and objects whose purposes weren't always clearly articulated, even by those who maintained them. We can see evidence of shared traditions that spread across the frontier region, suggesting cultural transmission and collective belief systems that operated alongside and intertwined with practical survival knowledge. The consistency of these practices across vast geographic distances and among populations that had limited contact with each other suggests either a common cultural origin or an independent development of similar responses to similar environmental pressures. But we can't fully reconstruct the mental world of these people, can't know with certainty what they believed about winter and cold and protection, can't definitively separate what was practical adaptation from what was spiritual practice, from what was simply tradition maintained because it had always been maintained. The iron charms hang in museum displays without revealing their secrets. The threshold pits remain open questions in archaeological reports. The stories about the black cold and the seeking wind persist as fragments of folklore that hint at experiences we can no longer fully understand. Each generation of researchers brings new methodologies and new interpretive frameworks to these questions, yet the core mysteries remain resistant to complete explanation, maintaining their essential ambiguity even under the scrutiny of modern academic analysis. The challenge of interpretation is compounded by the silence of the historical record on these matters. Silence that likely reflects not secrecy but simply the fact that certain knowledge wasn't considered worthy of documentation. Official records focused on matters of administration, trade, taxation, and legal disputes, while personal letters and diaries concerned themselves with practical affairs and social relationships. The quiet customs of protection, performed in the darkness before dawn or in the privacy of one's own cabin, weren't the sort of thing that seemed to require explanation or recording. They were simply part of the texture of daily life, as unremarkable to the people who practiced them as any other routine activity, and it's only their disappearance that has made them mysterious to us. Perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps it reflects something true about the frontier experience itself, that survival in such environments required acting on incomplete knowledge, maintaining practices that might or might not be effective, believing in protections that might or might not be real, simply because the alternative was to do nothing and hope for luck. The charms and the offerings and the hidden spaces might not have actually protected anyone from cold or storm, but they protected something else, the sense that you had done everything possible, that you had addressed every threat you could imagine, physical or otherwise, and that having done so you were entitled to sleep despite the wind howling outside. This psychological dimension of survival strategies is often overlooked in favor of purely material analyses, yet it may have been just as crucial to long-term survival as adequate food stores or well-constructed shelter. The rituals also served to structure time and create rhythm in an environment where the seasonal cycle was extreme and where winter brought a kind of temporal suspension. The regular maintenance of threshold pits, the periodic anointing of iron charms, the bread offerings on specific nights, all these practices provided markers in the otherwise undifferentiated flow of winter darkness. They gave people tasks to perform, schedules to maintain, small purposes that helped prevent the psychological deterioration that extended isolation and monotony can produce. In this sense, the protective rituals might have worked not through any supernatural mechanism, but through their effect on human psychology and social cohesion, keeping families engaged and active even when external conditions made most normal activities impossible. And in the end, perhaps that was their true purpose, not to stop the cold, which nothing could truly stop, but to make living with the cold bearable, to provide psychological armor against the constant pressure of danger, to let families rest, knowing they had performed all the proper rituals and taken all the proper precautions, and that whatever happened next was beyond their control. The mysteries remain, but their existence tells us something about how people negotiated with an indifferent universe, how they created meaning and structure in circumstances that threatened to overwhelm both. The frontier settlements of Siberia represented one of the most extreme environments in which human communities attempted to establish permanent residence, and the fact that they succeeded for generations speaks to an adaptability that went beyond mere physical hardiness to include psychological and cultural strategies for making the unbearable livable. Modern researchers continue to discover new cabin sites, new artifacts, new fragments of oral history that add to our understanding while simultaneously complicating the picture. A site excavated in 2019 near the Kolyma River revealed not only the familiar threshold pits and iron charms, but also a series of carved wooden objects that had been buried in a circle around the cabin at what appeared to be the cardinal points. The carvings showed stylized human figures with raised arms, their faces deliberately left blank or featureless. Carbon dating and dendrochronology placed the cabin's construction at around 1795, but the carved figures seemed older, their wood showing weathering patterns consistent with having been exposed to the elements for decades before being buried. This suggested that the figures were heirlooms or sacred objects brought from elsewhere and incorporated into the protective architecture of a new settlement, a practice that would indicate these customs had deeper roots than the frontier period itself. The discovery of children's graves at several excavated sites has added another layer to our understanding of frontier protective practices. In multiple instances, infant or child burials were found to include small iron objects similar to the threshold charms, suggesting that the protective symbolism extended beyond the living space to encompass the dead. Several graves contain bundles of the same plant materials found in door frames, artemisia, juniper, specific willows, arranged around the body in patterns that suggested deliberate ritual placement. One grave, that of a child aged perhaps 4 or 5 years, contained a particularly poignant assemblage: an iron charm, a bundle of dried flowers bound with birch bark, and a small clay vessel that analysis showed had once contained rendered animal fat, possibly the same substance used to feed the door charms. The careful attention to protecting the dead suggests a worldview in which the cold and the dangers it represented didn't end with death, but continued to pose threats that required ongoing vigilance and ritual defense. Linguistic analysis of the fragments of protective language that survive in oral histories has revealed interesting patterns. Many of the phrases used to describe protective practices employ a grammatical structure that linguists associate with very old forms of Russian, suggesting these customs predated the frontier settlements and were brought from European Russia or even further west. Some terms appear to have roots in Old Church Slavonic, while others show possible borrowing from Finnish or Baltic languages, hinting at the complex cultural mixing that occurred as populations moved eastward. A few phrases resist easy linguistic classification, employing word combinations or grammatical structures that don't fit comfortably into any known regional dialect, raising the possibility that they represent fragments of traditions so old that the language itself has become partially opaque even to native speakers. The iron charms themselves, when subjected to metallurgical analysis, have yielded surprising results. The iron composition varies widely, with some charms made from relatively pure iron, while others contain significant amounts of other elements: carbon, phosphorus, traces of various metals. Several charms showed evidence of having been forged from recycled materials, likely broken tools or hardware, while others appeared to have been made from iron specifically smelted for the purpose. What's particularly interesting is that the most elaborate and carefully crafted charms don't always correlate with the wealthiest cabin sites. Some of the finest examples were found at locations showing signs of poverty. Minimal possessions, simple construction, small living spaces, suggesting that the investment in protective charms took priority over other forms of material comfort, or that the ability to craft such charms was itself a valuable skill that didn't necessarily correlate with conventional measures of wealth. The relationship between the protective practices and documented religious life in frontier settlements remains ambiguous. Church records from the period show that most settlements had at least periodic access to Orthodox priests, and that marriages, baptisms, and other sacraments were regularly performed. Yet the protective customs don't align neatly with Orthodox Christian theology or practice. The iron charms don't depict crosses or recognize saints. The plant materials aren't those used in church ceremonies, and the rituals described in oral histories don't match Orthodox prayer. While ordinary settlers huddled in single-room cabins and counted their firewood by the log, listening to every creak of stressed timber and every shift in the wind's direction, there existed on the frontier a small number of people whose experience of winter was profoundly different. These were the administrators, the military officers, the wealthy merchants who had established themselves in the larger settlements, and their relationship with the season that dominated life in Siberia bore little resemblance to that of the common families scattered throughout the wilderness. The governor's residence in Yakutsk during the late 18th century was not a palace by the standards of Moscow or St. Petersburg, but by frontier standards it represented luxury almost beyond imagining. The building was constructed not of simple logs but of heavy timbers, carefully selected and transported. Some of them brought hundreds of kilometers at enormous expense. The structure stood 2 stories high with a foundation of stone that elevated it above the snow line and protected it from the moisture and frost that plagued ground-level constructions. The most striking difference between the governor's manor and ordinary cabins lay in its heating system. Not a single hearth that required constant tending, but multiple stoves positioned throughout the building, each one a massive construction of brick and tile that could hold heat for hours after the fire within had burned down to coals. These stoves, based on designs from Northern Europe and adapted for Siberian conditions, represented an investment greater than most frontier families' entire net worth. But they transformed winter life from a constant battle against cold into something approaching comfort. Imagine entering this building on a night when the temperature outside has dropped to 40 degrees below freezing, when ordinary settlers are wrapped in every layer they own and still shivering. The entrance hall itself is warm, not merely less cold, but genuinely warm, with heated air rising from vents connected to the basement, where servants maintain a furnace that burns constantly throughout the winter months. Your breath doesn't steam here, and you can remove your heavy outer garments without fear of freezing within minutes. The main receiving room, where the governor conducts official business and entertains the limited number of people in the region whose social standing permits such interaction, is illuminated not by a single dim lantern but by dozens of candles in elaborate holders, their light reflecting off polished wood surfaces and the few luxury items, a mirror from France, porcelain from China, that speak to connections with a world far removed from this frozen territory. The floor is covered with carpets brought from Persia or the Caucasus, providing both insulation and a softness underfoot that frontier settlers wouldn't recognize as belonging to a floor. The evening routine in such a household bears no resemblance to the constant vigilance required in ordinary cabins. As darkness falls, servants move through the rooms lighting candles and lamps, adjusting dampers on the stoves to maintain optimal heat distribution, drawing heavy curtains across windows to create an additional layer of insulation against the night cold. The residents, the governor himself, perhaps his wife and children, if he has brought family to this posting, visiting officials or military officers, gather in the warmth without concern for whether the fire will last through the night or whether the roof will hold under accumulating snow. Dinner is served in a formal dining room, at a proper table with chairs rather than on rough benches, or while sitting on the floor near a hearth. The food itself represents privilege in its most basic form, not just adequate calories to sustain life, but variety and quality that ordinary settlers couldn't dream of. There might be imported wine or vodka from established distilleries rather than crude, local spirits, bread made from fine flour that was transported at great expense rather than coarse grain ground by hand, preserved meats that were salted and smoked properly rather than barely kept from spoiling. The meal proceeds slowly without the hurried efficiency that characterized eating in ordinary households where warmth and light were precious resources to be conserved. Conversation happens without the undercurrent of anxiety about fuel supplies or storm damage, without one person constantly needing to excuse themselves to check the fire or investigate a concerning sound. The servants who bring each course and clear each plate have themselves eaten earlier, in the kitchen where they also sleep, near the warmth of the cooking stove, their own comfort far beyond that of most frontier residents, even though they occupy the lowest tier of the elite household. After dinner, the family might retire to a parlor, where a particularly fine stove maintains temperature at levels that allow for leisure activities requiring manual dexterity, needlework, writing letters, reading by adequate light without straining the eyes. The governor might review administrative documents or compose reports to be sent to regional headquarters when weather permits travel. His wife might work on embroidery or play a musical instrument, a pianoforte or harpsichord that somehow survived the long journey from European Russia and that remains more or less in tune despite the temperature variations. The children, if there are children, are already asleep upstairs in bedrooms that are individual rather than communal, each one heated by ducts that carry warmth from the main stoves. Their beds have proper mattresses stuffed with goose down rather than straw or moss, and their blankets are wool or even silk rather than roughly cured animal hides. They sleep in night clothes designed for the purpose rather than simply wearing their day clothes to bed, and when they wake, if they wake, it's not because cold has penetrated their sleeping space, but perhaps because a servant has come to add wood to a stove, or because they've had an ordinary childhood dream. The contrast with life in ordinary cabins is so extreme as to seem almost obscene, and yet the people living this privileged existence often failed to recognize quite how vast the gulf was. The governor might congratulate himself on enduring the hardships of frontier service, on being posted so far from civilization, on making do with accommodations that were primitive by the standards of the capital. He might write letters home describing the difficulties of his position, the isolation and the cold, never quite grasping that his version of cold and isolation bore almost no relation to what most of the people under his nominal jurisdiction experienced. And yet the privilege was not absolute and the comfort was not complete, because winter on the frontier acknowledged no one's social rank when it chose to demonstrate its full power. The governor's manor, for all its superior construction and heating systems, was still a structure made of materials that responded to extreme cold, and there were nights when even that elaborately protected space felt vulnerable to the forces pressing in from outside. The winter of 1799 brought a storm that tested every building in Yakutsk, regardless of how well constructed or well provisioned. The temperature dropped to levels that even the oldest residents struggled to remember experiencing before, and the wind achieved velocities that turned snow into a cutting instrument and found ways through defenses that had seemed secure. The governor at that time was a man named Pyotr Ivanovich Glazunov, a career administrator in his 50s who had served in Siberia for more than a decade and who thought he understood winter's capabilities. The storm arrived without much warning on an evening in late January, the wind rising from a breeze to a roar in less than an hour. Governor Glazunov was at dinner when the first serious gusts hit, strong enough to rattle the heavy shutters that covered the windows and to send a puff of smoke back down one of the chimneys, despite the supposed impossibility of such a thing happening with properly designed flues. The candles flickered wildly, and conversation paused as everyone in the dining room instinctively looked toward the windows, toward the walls, assessing whether the building was truly as secure as they had assumed. The servants moved quickly to secure additional shutters and to adjust the stoves, but as the evening progressed it became clear that this storm was operating on a different scale than what the household usually managed with routine preparations. The temperature inside the manor began dropping despite the fires burning steadily, cold infiltrating through pathways that shouldn't have existed, finding its way past the stone foundation and the heavy timbers and the multiple layers of protection. By midnight, breath was visible even in the main receiving room, and the governor ordered additional stoves lit in rooms that usually managed with passive heat from adjacent spaces. The fuel supply, which had seemed more than adequate for any conceivable winter, suddenly appeared less certain. Each stove consumed wood at a prodigious rate when run at maximum output, and with all stoves operating simultaneously, the household was burning through its carefully accumulated stores far faster than anticipated. The steward responsible for managing supplies came to the governor with calculations that were deeply concerning. If the storm lasted more than a few days at this intensity, if the temperature remained this low, they would need to make choices about which parts of the building to keep heated and which to surrender to the cold. This calculation, which ordinary settlers made routinely and which shaped their entire winter strategy, was new and alarming to the elite household. The idea that they might need to consolidate into fewer rooms, might need to abandon parts of their own home to the cold, the way people abandoned outlying structures, represented a failure of the privilege they had taken for granted. And yet the mathematics were undeniable. The wood would last only so long, and if they exhausted their supply before the storm ended, they would be in a position far worse than if they conserved now. The governor made the decision to close off the upper floor entirely, to have everyone sleep in the main floor rooms near the largest stoves. Servants carried down bedding and essential items, creating makeshift sleeping arrangements in spaces designed for daytime activities. The children, who normally had their own bedrooms, found themselves sharing a parlor with parents and household staff, all distinctions of rank temporarily suspended by the simple need to cluster near reliable heat sources. The night was long and largely sleepless, with the wind screaming around the manor's corners and the timbers groaning under stress that seemed designed to find the breaking point of every joint and connection. The governor, lying on an improvised bed in what had been his receiving room, discovered that his thoughts were indistinguishable from those of the ordinary settlers he normally governed from a position of comfortable distance, wondering if the building would hold, calculating fuel reserves, listening to every sound for signs of structural failure, and feeling the peculiar helplessness that comes from knowing that your survival depends on preparations made in the past and choices that can no longer be changed. Morning brought no relief as the storm continued through a second day and into a second night. The household settled into a routine of careful fuel management, burning only what was absolutely necessary, letting some rooms grow cold enough that water left in them froze solid. The food supplies remained adequate, but the ability to cook was limited by the need to conserve fuel, and meals became simpler and less frequent. The servants, who normally maintained elaborate routines of cleaning and service, focused exclusively on essential tasks, managing the fires, preparing minimal food, and monitoring the building for problems. On the third day, one of the main chimneys became partially blocked by ice formation, causing smoke to back up into the room it served and forcing the household to extinguish that stove entirely until the blockage could be cleared. This was dangerous work that required someone to climb onto the roof in conditions that made every movement treacherous, and the governor found himself in the peculiar position of offering extra payment to whichever servant was willing to risk their life for a task that, in normal times, would have been routine maintenance. The young man who volunteered was the son of a frontier settler family, someone who had entered elite service as a pathway to a better life, but who still carried with him the skills and attitudes of his origins. He roped himself securely, climbed carefully, and worked with the methodical patience that comes from understanding that rushing in dangerous conditions is how people die. He cleared the blockage, returned safely, and accepted the governor's promised payment with a quiet dignity that spoke to his awareness that he had likely just saved the household from disaster. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the governor ventured outside for the first time and saw a landscape transformed and hostile. Snow had drifted to heights that buried fences and covered the lower windows of buildings. Several smaller structures in the compound, storage sheds, servants' quarters, stables, had sustained damage or collapsed entirely. The temperature remained brutally low, low enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, low enough that breathing the air caused pain deep in the chest. The fuel situation was critical. The household had perhaps 5 days of wood remaining if they continued careful rationing, less if temperatures didn't moderate. For the first time in his administrative career, the governor understood viscerally what it meant to be at the mercy of winter, to have done everything possible to prepare and still find that the season could push beyond those preparations and create genuine danger. He sent messengers to nearby settlements asking if anyone had fuel to spare, willing to pay premium prices, and discovered that no one did. Everyone was in similar straits. Everyone had burned through their reserves faster than anticipated, and the question on everyone's mind was whether spring would come before the wood ran out. The situation resolved through a combination of luck and marginally warmer weather. The extreme cold, moderated to merely severe cold, reducing consumption rates enough that supplies stretched further. Additional fuel was located in a storage area that the steward had overlooked in his initial calculations, and households throughout the region, including the governors, began burning furniture and non-essential wooden items, sacrificing long-term assets to meet immediate needs. But the experience changed Governor Glazunov's understanding of his position on the frontier. He had arrived in Siberia thinking of himself as enduring hardship, as suffering for his service, while simultaneously maintaining a lifestyle that was comfortable by any reasonable standard. The storm had stripped away that comfortable illusion and shown him that the privilege he enjoyed was contingent and fragile, that winter could equalize all ranks when it chose to demonstrate its full power, and that the gap between elite life and death was perhaps not as wide as he had imagined. In his official reports after the storm, Glazunov wrote with uncharacteristic humility about the difficulties faced by frontier settlers, about the inadequacy of standard provisions and preparations, about the need for better support systems and emergency reserves. His recommendations were largely ignored by officials in more comfortable postings who couldn't imagine conditions severe enough to threaten even a well-provisioned household, who thought the governor was exaggerating or had simply been unfortunate, who didn't understand that the frontier operated according to rules that made mockery of normal assumptions about safety and security. The governor's wife, a woman named Yekaterina Sergeyevna, who had never wanted to come to Siberia, but who had accompanied her husband out of duty, found her own perspectives shifting after the storm. She had spent her first years on the frontier, maintaining as much as possible the habits and standards of her upbringing in a wealthy Moscow family, insisting on proper dress and formal meals and social rituals that seemed absurdly out of place in the wilderness. After the storm, she quietly abandoned many of these pretenses, accepting that life here required adaptations she had resisted making. She began spending time with the wives of local merchants and lower officials, women she had previously considered beneath her social station, learning from them about practical matters of household management in extreme conditions. She discovered that these women, who lacked her education and refinement, possessed knowledge about survival that was far more valuable in the frontier context than anything her privileged upbringing had provided. They taught her about preserving food in ways that extended supplies further, about layering clothing for maximum warmth with minimum bulk, about reading weather signs and preparing in advance rather than reacting after conditions had already turned dangerous. The children of elite families on the frontier occupied a strange position between the privilege they inherited and the reality of their environment. They had better food and warmer houses than ordinary children, but they also experienced a kind of isolation that was in some ways more severe. Ordinary frontier children grew up embedded in communities where everyone understood their struggles, where mutual aid was common and expected, where hardship was shared and normalized. Elite children were separated by social barriers from most other children, expected to maintain standards of behavior and education that seemed disconnected from the world around them, and often deeply lonely despite their material advantages. The governor's daughter, Sofia Petrovna, was 15 during the winter of the Great Storm, old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to still be forming her basic understanding of the world and her place in it. Before the storm, she had thought of the frontier as a temporary exile, a place she would leave as soon as possible to return to proper civilization in European Russia. She had spent her time studying literature and music and languages, preparing for a life that would happen elsewhere, treating her current location as something to be endured rather than engaged with. The storm changed something in her perspective, though she would have struggled to articulate exactly what. Seeing her father, a man she had thought of as powerful and in control, reduced to the same anxieties and fears as everyone else, seeing the fragility of the comfort she had taken for granted, made her aware that the categories she had used to organize her understanding of the world were less fixed than she had believed. The servants she had barely noticed as individuals became people she recognized as possessing skills and knowledge that were, in that moment, more valuable than her education or refinement. After the storm, Sophia began paying more attention to the world immediately around her, rather than focusing all her attention on a future elsewhere. She learned to monitor fuel supplies and weather signs, to help with practical tasks rather than considering such work beneath her dignity, to understand the rhythms and demands of frontier life rather than treating them as irrelevant to her real existence. Her parents noticed the change and had complicated feelings about it, pride that their daughter was becoming more capable and practical, but also concern that she was losing the refinement and culture they had worked to instill, that she was being coarsened by the frontier in ways that might make her less suited for the life they still hoped she would eventually lead. The social structure of frontier settlements was complicated by these divisions between elite and common residents. The elites depended on the common settlers for labor and for the production of food and goods, but they also often held themselves apart, maintaining distinctions of rank that seemed increasingly arbitrary the harder winter pressed. Common settlers could see the manor houses with their smoke rising from multiple chimneys, could know that some people were warm while they shivered, and while open rebellion was rare, the resentment was real and persistent. Yet the relationship was not purely antagonistic, because the elites also provided certain functions that benefited everyone. The governor's residence was often the most secure building in a settlement, and during the worst emergencies it sometimes served as a refuge for people whose own homes had failed. The governor had authority to organize collective responses to crises, to requisition and redistribute resources when necessary, to coordinate aid for families who had lost everything to fire or collapse or other disaster. And the wealth of elite households meant they could afford to employ people, providing income that allowed some families to survive periods when their own provisions ran short. The priest who served the small church in Yakutsk during this period was a man named Father Grigory, and his perspective on the divide between elite and common was shaped by his religious calling. He saw both the governor in his manor and the poorest settlers in their crude cabins, hearing confessions and offering spiritual guidance to people across the social spectrum. What struck him most, he wrote in letters to his superiors, was how similar everyone became when winter was at its worst. The same fears, the same prayers, the same desperate hope that they would survive to see spring. Father Grigory noted that the prayers offered by the governor's family during the great storm were indistinguishable from those offered by the humblest settlers, that privilege provided no protection against existential fear, that death from cold was the great equalizer that made all human hierarchies seem temporary and contingent. He tried to use this insight in his sermons, attempting to build a sense of common humanity that might bridge the social divisions, but found that his message was received differently by different audiences. The poor heard it as validation that their suffering was acknowledged, while the wealthy heard it as a comforting narrative that allowed them to feel they shared in hardships while continuing to enjoy their privileges. The question of what obligations the wealthy had to the poor was a recurring theme in frontier life, particularly after disasters that affected everyone, but that devastated some more than others. When a poor family lost their cabin to collapse or fire, they might be left with literally nothing: no shelter, no food stores, no tools, no seed for the next planting season. They became entirely dependent on the charity of others, and whether that charity materialized often depended on factors that seemed arbitrary, whether they were well-liked, whether they had family connections, whether the timing was good or bad, whether the potential givers had surplus or were themselves struggling. Elite families sometimes provided aid, but often it came with conditions or expectations, labor obligations, deference, acceptance of a subordinate status that might persist for years or even generations. The aid could be genuine and life-saving, but it could also be a way of reinforcing social hierarchies, of ensuring that the poor remained dependent and grateful rather than independent and equal. The recipients of such aid understood this dynamic but usually had no choice except to accept the terms offered, and the memory of dependence could create resentments that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. Governor Glazunov, after his experience with the Great Storm, tried to develop more systematic approaches to winter preparedness and emergency response. He proposed establishing community woodpiles that would be available to families who ran short, funded through taxation of the wealthier households. He suggested building communal warming houses where people could retreat if their own homes became uninhabitable. He advocated for better advance warning systems and coordination so that when major storms were coming, everyone would have at least some notice to prepare. Most of these proposals were never implemented, partly because of bureaucratic inertia, and partly because the wealthier families resisted increased taxation or any measures that might reduce their relative advantages. The arguments they made were familiar, that people needed to take responsibility for their own preparation, that creating safety nets would reduce incentives for careful planning, that it wasn't fair to penalize the successful to help the improvident. These arguments had the veneer of principle but were largely self-serving, a way of justifying maintaining their privileges while avoiding obligations to others. What the elite families often failed to understand, or chose not to understand, was how much of their own success was built on advantages rather than merit. They had the resources to build better houses because they had inherited wealth or positions that provided income. They had better food because they could afford to buy from others rather than depending entirely on what they could produce themselves. They had access to information and education that allowed them to make better decisions. Their survival rate was higher, not because they were more capable or more virtuous, but because the system was structured to favor them. The winter nights in the governor's manor were warmer and safer than those in ordinary cabins, but they were still winter nights on the frontier, still subject to the same fundamental forces, even if those forces were mediated by layers of privilege. The people sleeping in fine beds under down comforters were still listening to the wind, still aware at some level that their protection was contingent, still carrying a thread of the same anxiety that kept ordinary settlers awake through the dark hours. The gap between elite and common was vast but not infinite, and winter was the season that reminded everyone of their shared vulnerability. As spring finally approached and the days grew longer, and the temperatures began their slow climb toward tolerable levels, the social divisions that had been somewhat softened by winter's equalizing pressure began to reassert themselves. The governor returned to his administrative routines and his social position. The elite families resumed their habits of distinction and separation. The common settlers went back to their work and their struggles, and the memory of the Great Storm became another story to tell, another marker of survival, another piece of knowledge about what winter could do when it chose to demonstrate its power. But something had shifted subtly and perhaps temporarily in how people understood their relationships and their place in the frontier hierarchy. The elite had been reminded that their privilege was fragile. The common settlers had seen that even the powerful could be reduced to fear and desperation. And everyone had been shown again that winter was the ultimate authority on the frontier, the force that made all human pretensions and hierarchies seem small and temporary against the vastness of cold and darkness and the patient hostility of a season that would kill anyone who failed to respect it. And so we have traveled together through the long nights of the Siberian frontier, through the experiences of those who fought their patient battles against cold and darkness and the relentless pressure of winter. We have sat by fires that needed constant tending, have listened to winds that seemed to search for weakness, have felt the weight of responsibility that came with protecting those who depended on you in an environment that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. We have walked alongside Yakov Petrovich as he stood beneath a failing beam, making adjustments in the darkness that would determine whether his family saw morning. We have examined the mysterious objects and practices that people employed, the iron charms and threshold offerings and hidden spaces that spoke to needs that went beyond simple physical survival, that addressed fears and uncertainties that couldn't be solved with better construction or larger woodpiles. And we have seen how privilege provided comfort, but not immunity, how even those with resources and position could be reduced to the same fundamental anxieties that shaped every winter night on the frontier. The people we have followed through these quiet explorations are gone now, long gone. Yakov Petrovich and Agrafena, Governor Glazunov and his family, the anonymous settlers who left only archaeological traces and fading oral histories, they all eventually faced their final winter and passed into whatever lies beyond the struggles of physical existence. The cabins they built have mostly collapsed or been replaced. The clearings they carved from wilderness have often returned to forest, and the world they knew has been transformed by changes they could never have imagined. But something of their experience remains accessible to us, something we can touch through the evidence they left behind and through the simple act of imagining what their nights must have been like. We can understand, even from our position of comfort and safety, what it meant to lie awake listening to storm, to calculate fuel reserves and wonder if they would be enough, to carry the weight of keeping others alive through sheer vigilance and preparation, and the refusal to surrender to exhaustion or fear. There is something profound in this connection across time, this ability to feel kinship with people separated from us by centuries and by circumstances almost incomprehensibly different from our own. When we imagine ourselves in that cabin, listening to that wind, tending that fire, we're not just engaging in an academic exercise or indulging in nostalgia for a past we never experienced. We're recognizing something fundamental about human existence, that people have always struggled against difficulty, have always found ways to protect what mattered to them, have always combined practical knowledge with hope and ritual and community to make survival possible. The frontier settlers we have followed developed remarkable expertise in managing their environment, in reading weather and building structures and organizing their lives around the demands of extreme climate. But they also recognized the limits of that expertise, acknowledged that preparation could only go so far, and created practices that addressed the psychological and spiritual dimensions of their situation. The iron charms didn't actually stop the cold, but perhaps they helped people sleep despite the cold, and in that sense their power was real, even if it operated through belief rather than physics. We live now in a world where winter has been largely tamed, where central heating and insulation and weather forecasting have made the season an inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. We can adjust our thermostats with a casual gesture that would have seemed like magic to Yakov Petrovich. We can know days in advance when storms are coming and can prepare with a trip to a well-stocked store rather than months of careful accumulation. We can be reasonably confident that if something goes wrong, help is available, emergency services and hospitals and social systems that catch people before they fall into true desperation. This is genuine progress, genuine improvement in human welfare, and there is no virtue in pretending otherwise or romanticizing the hardships of the past. The people struggling through frontier winters would have gladly traded their situation for ours, would have considered our complaints about minor inconveniences to be incomprehensible given the comfort we enjoy. They endured not because hardship was noble, but because they had no choice, and their endurance was born from necessity rather than preference. And yet, in our comfort, we might have lost something they possessed, a certain clarity about what matters, a direct connection between action and survival, an understanding that safety is not guaranteed and comfort is not natural, but rather the result of constant effort and attention. We have gained much and lost little that was actually valuable, but perhaps occasionally it's worth remembering what life was like when winter was not just a season, but a test, when protection meant vigilance rather than technology, when family safety depended on individual decisions made hour by hour through the long darkness. The rhythm of their days, the routine of checking and maintaining and preparing, the acceptance that rest was temporary and danger was persistent, these shaped a particular kind of awareness that we rarely need to develop now. We can go days or weeks without thinking seriously about survival, without making decisions that might determine whether we live or die, without feeling the weight of responsibility for others in quite such an immediate and physical way. This is wonderful. This is what civilization provides, but it also distances us from certain fundamental aspects of human experience that shaped most of our ancestors' lives. As spring approached on the Siberian frontier, the changes came slowly and sometimes seemed to stall or reverse before finally establishing themselves. A day of warming would be followed by another storm. A period of thaw would be interrupted by a sudden freeze, and people learned not to trust any single sign, but to wait for the cumulative evidence that winter was truly releasing its grip. The snow would develop a crust, then begin to sink and compact, then develop channels where meltwater ran, then gradually diminish until patches of earth became visible for the first time in months. The light changed before the temperature, the sun rising higher in the sky and staying visible longer, until eventually the day length exceeded the night and people could work outside in the evening without immediately needing artificial light. The forest began making sounds again, not just wind and cracking ice, but the calls of birds returning from migration, the drip of water from branches, the crack and rumble of river ice breaking up. These sounds were markers of transition, evidence that the world was waking from its frozen sleep and returning to a state where life could expand rather than just persist. For the settlers, spring meant a frenzy of new work, repairing winter damage, planting crops, hunting and fishing, while game was abundant, preparing for the brief summer that would allow them to accumulate resources for the next winter. There was no season of rest, no period when survival didn't require effort, but at least the effort was directed toward growth rather than merely holding ground against decline. The anxiety of winter gave way to the exhaustion of spring and summer, a different kind of pressure, but one that felt more hopeful because it was working toward abundance rather than managing scarcity. They would look back on the winter they had survived with a mixture of emotions, relief that it was over, pride that they had endured, awareness of what it had cost them in resources and energy, and the wear on their bodies and spirits. They would count their losses, livestock that didn't survive, stores that ran out and required sacrifices, the persistent cold-related injuries that would affect their capabilities for months. But they would also count themselves lucky to have survived at all, knowing that not everyone had, that in every winter there were families who didn't make it through, whose stories ended in the cold, and whose cabins stood empty come spring. The memory of winter shaped their summer decisions, making them perhaps more careful about preparation than they might otherwise have been, driving them to accumulate a bit more than calculation suggested was necessary, to reinforce structures that had held but might not hold again, to think ahead to the next test, even while the current warmth made winter seem impossibly distant. This cycle, survival, recovery, preparation, survival again, defined frontier existence and created a particular relationship with time where the past and future were always present in current decisions. We who listen to their story from positions of comfort, who have never had to tend a fire through the night, or calculate whether our fuel will last, or protect our families with our own vigilance and skill, can still feel something of what they experienced. We can imagine ourselves there in that cabin, can feel the cold that presses against the walls, can understand the exhaustion and the anxiety and the small victories of making it through another night. And in that imagination, in that momentary connection across time and circumstance, we honor their experience and acknowledge our own fortune. The wind still blows across the Siberian frontier, across the lands where those settlements once stood. The forests still grow and the rivers still freeze, and winter still comes with its demands and its dangers. But the people who struggled there, who developed their expertise and their rituals and their quiet courage, have passed into history and memory. What remains are the traces they left, the archaeological evidence, the written records, the oral histories that fade with each passing generation, and our ability to reconstruct from those traces something of what their lives were like. Tonight, as you settle into your own warmth and safety, as you let your thoughts drift and your breathing slow, you might spare a moment of gratitude for the distance between your circumstances and theirs. You don't need to tend a fire or check door latches or listen for signs of structural failure. You don't need to calculate fuel supplies or ration food or protect your loved ones through sheer vigilance against an environment that would kill them given the smallest opportunity. You can simply rest, can let go of the day's concerns, can trust that morning will come and you will be safe. This is a gift given to you by countless generations who worked to make the world safer and more comfortable, who accumulated knowledge and built systems and created the civilization that protects you now. The frontier settlers were part of that process, were among the people who pushed back against wilderness and danger, who learned how to survive in impossible conditions, and who passed that knowledge forward. Their struggles were real and their victories were hard-won, and the comfort you enjoy now is built on their efforts and the efforts of millions like them. So let yourself relax completely. Let the tension drain from your body. Let your mind release its grip on the thoughts and concerns that occupied it during your waking hours. You have heard the story of winter nights on the frontier, have traveled through that cold and darkness with the people who endured it, and now you return to your own warm and safe space, carrying perhaps a small bit of their experience, a momentary understanding of what it took to survive when survival was never guaranteed. The fire in their cabin has long since gone cold, the embers turned to ash and scattered by winds that have blown for centuries. The cabin itself has collapsed or been dismantled, returned to the forest that provided its timbers. The people who lived there have completed their journeys and found whatever rest awaits beyond the struggles of physical existence. But their story remains quiet and patient, waiting to be remembered by those of us who come after, who benefit from their efforts without having to share their hardships. And now, as this journey through history comes to its gentle end, as we step back from that frozen frontier and return to our own time and place, let the story fade like a dream fading at the edge of waking. Let the wind in your mind grow quiet, let the cold recede, let the concerns and anxieties that shape their nights dissolve into the warmth and safety that surrounds you. You have traveled far tonight, through time and hardship, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people, and now it's time to rest. Sleep well, safe in the knowledge that winter has been tamed, that the struggles of the frontier are history rather than present danger, that you can surrender to rest without needing to maintain vigilance or prepare for threat. Sleep well, and let the memory of those long-ago nights remind you, gently and without urgency, of how far humanity has come and how much we have gained. Sleep well, and dream of spring arriving, of warmth returning, of morning light breaking across snow that will soon melt into the earth and nourish new growth. The story is told, the night is quiet, and you are safe. Let that be enough. Let sleep come gently, like snow settling on still air, like dawn approaching with patient inevitability, like the slow end of winter's hold on a world waiting to breathe again. Rest now, rest well, and know that morning will come, as it always has, as it always will, bringing with it light and warmth and the continuation of your own story in a world made safer by those who came before. Good night.